Good morning. Welcome to day two. Well done for making it to day two. This morning's session is called Stories of Secrecy. My name is George Stone, and I'm going to be facilitating. Nick Shaxson over there is going to be the discussant. We have two great journalists here with us, giving us their stories. The first is Sigrid Davidsdottir, who's from Iceland, who's going to tell us about the offshoreization of an economy. And we have Richard Smith, who, if you see on his badge, he says blogger, but he's actually, if you think blogger, you think man sitting in his underwear at home. And I don't want to think of Richard like that. So I'm going to say journalist.
I hope you don't blog, George.
But I say that not just because I don't want to think of Richard in his underwear, but also because he is a serious investigative journalist who at Naked Capitalism regularly breaks very important, interesting stories about the world we all are interested in. So I'm just going to say, abuse my position as chair for a couple of seconds to say a couple of things about framing this discussion. There seems there's a lot of stories that come out. You know, if you look at the history of this issue, people were scandalized by offshore because lots of people didn't know it exists. I mean, people outside of this room. And then there was the scandal of the facilitators, the bankers, the accountants, etc. And it seems to me that a lot of these stories in the future will be about how states facilitate these issues, and not just small Caribbean states, but also serious global powers, and how increasingly these things are becoming legitimate. And that ties together, I think, a bit of the two stories we're going to hear today, because Iceland is the extreme example of this, where a country just was taken offshore. And the stories we're going to hear from Richard about Moldova and how Scottish limited partnerships were abused and other mechanisms are about how laws are constructed in a way to facilitate lots of illicit financial flows. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time, and I'm going to hand over to Sigrid, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you. It's a fantastic opportunity to tell you about Iceland. Thanks a million for the invitation. I'm very happy to talk about these things with an audience who is equally interested. So Iceland is rightly, as you said, an extreme case of offshoreization. It really happened very quickly, and it took only a few years, and people didn't really know what was going on. So Iceland, obviously, it's a republic since 44, 330,000 inhabitants, and it's a very rich country. So the collapse saga can, of course, be told in a report of 2,600 pages, which has already been done, but it can also be told in two pictures. So these two persons, the driver is a politician who has just been named in the Panama Papers. The man sitting next to him is a businessman who has been sentenced to 4 or 5 years in prison because of things he did. And this graph is this is lending to one company. And why did the lending increase there in 2007? It's because the businessman and he himself, the group he belonged to, bought a bank. So this is what happens to the lending to his company when he owned the bank. So this is about, the collapse was very much about personal relations and bad banking. Now, what Icelanders knew was that there was a major privatization, and it was connected to politics. It started in 1990s. The banks were privatized. That was ended at the end of 2002. The banks expanded abroad. They went to Luxembourg, London, and the Nordic countries. And 2008, the companies were owned by the big banks. They had been they had expanded abroad, and so had the companies. Now this all was like a glory and success. And this is what sort of Iceland had seen. What Icelanders didn't know was the extensive offshoreization of both companies and private individuals. Now, I first started to look at this shortly after the collapse in autumn 2008. Then I remembered I had seen something related to one of these companies, and that was from the Luxembourg, these memorials, these Tagesblatt, these where they, like the Luxembourg Gazette. So I realized I had seen something there, so I thought, okay, well, I should maybe look around. So I started digging around in these publications, and obviously was completely amazed at what I saw, because basically they were all there, and you could then see the names of the offshore vehicles that they had. I mean, all of this would be very familiar to you, but this is sort of how I came to it. So the offshore view was that there was the banking collapse, and what we learned about the offshoreization was basically after the banking collapse. In December 2008, they set up a special investigative committee. There was also the Office for Special Prosecutor. So from all of this, we learned quite a lot. There were stories, there were rumors, there were media reports. And in April 2010, there was the SIC report. So it's the report of the Special Investigative Commission. And there have been more than 20 charges brought by the Special Prosecutor. And all of this has been a source of great knowledge. So there were about maybe 250, 300 people. There are probably more, because we have seen many more names in the Panama Papers. And the remarkable thing about the Icelandic offshoreization was how little you had to own. These were not sort of immensely wealthy people, but just, remotely well off. Obviously, they might own something in around 300,000 pounds, and the banks would offer them offshore companies. And Iceland is a small country, so if you live in you move in a certain circle, and your friends, your business partners, they all have offshore companies, and you obviously start to think, oh, that's the necessary business. It goes with the business, basically. So what is unique about the Icelandic offshoreization is that it's much more widespread than anywhere else. And as I say, the sums, the wealth you needed to sort of be invited into that world was a lot less than you would have in most other countries. And it even enriched the vocabulary. In my reporting, I started to talk about tortola companies, and that basically has become the synonym for offshore companies. And then we had the Panama Papers. And that has obviously further enriched our knowledge of all of this. And what it has given us, many more names of politicians. You will all have heard that the Prime Minister of Iceland resigned when he was confronted in an interview. He sort of didn't know what to say, and then in the end he lied, and he lost the support of the coalition. So he was forced out. So we have many more names now, and we have sort of details of use. And just to give you some stories, some examples of how these companies have been used, the offshore companies, for both companies and individuals. There was, for example, these two companies, Meidr and Gaumur. They were set up actually on the same day in Luxembourg. So that was in '98. It was one of the first offshore vehicles. And as you can see, they were set up by tortola companies, by service providers in the BVI actually owned by Kaupthing, one of the Icelandic banks, the bank that set this up. So these two companies were, as I say, the interesting thing, the same day they were set up. One of them, Mather, became later, sort of went through some stages, but always sort of controlled by Kaupthing in some way. This company became a major shareholder in Kaupthing. It was financed by Kaupthing, and as I say, the owners were changing, but it was also always a bank which kind of was in control. Daumer became the business vehicle for one of these Viking raiders, as they were called, one of these big businessmen in Iceland. It had also close linked to Kaupthing for a while, but as I say, Kaupthing sort of made these companies big, and then Kaupthing could lend them more, and they would become bigger, and Kaupthing could lend them more, and Kaupthing would grow, and they would grow. So this was like it was like a happy spiral for these businessmen and for the bank, and obviously it turned out to be an extremely unhappy spiral for Iceland. A second example for companies is Landsbanki, another bank. It had 8 offshore companies. The interesting thing is that these offshore companies were set up before 2002, and why is that interesting? Because the bank was privatized in 2002, but it actually started setting up the offshore vehicles well before that. So the bank itself owned these 8 companies. This wasn't known at the time, and apparently the reason was to hold the employees' options. But for some reason, that was the motivation given, but the companies were never used for that. Now, privatization, 2002, in comes a large owner, actually a company owned by father and son who got wealthy in Russia in the 90s, another interesting saga. So these large owners, they owned these 42%. Now the 8 offshore companies, they had roughly 13% shares in the bank. So this meant that they obviously were controlled by the Landsbanki management. So in reality, the major owner, this father and son, they actually controlled more than 50% of the bank, and that obviously wasn't known at the time. Now, as to the offshore and individuals, example 1, it's Vintris, this company which has become world famous. It was owned by, and still is obviously, owned by the Prime Minister's wife. So this Prime Minister, Sigmundur Davíð Gunnlaugsson, came into office in 2013. Nobody knew about this company. Vintris, it had also claims in the fallen banks. That is to say, it had bought bonds from the bank. So when the banks collapsed, it became a creditor. Now, one of the main things that the government needed to do was to deal with the creditors of the banks. Nobody knew that actually the Prime Minister, who was in charge of this work and this process, he was a creditor, or he and his wife. In addition, the Prime Minister talked a lot about the importance of sort of believing in Iceland and believing in the Icelandic krona. Nobody knew at the time that he had his wealth, his family wealth was outside of Iceland, which sort of gives his words a slightly different tone. Now, a second example is a person who was completely unknown in Iceland, Hrólfur Aldursson. He was a Progressive Party official, so he came from the same party as the Prime Minister. He had on and offshore companies. They were used for hidden acquisitions of companies. They were also receiving favorable loans, and they had ties to a progressive minister, actually the man sitting at the wheel on the one of the first slides. The third example is the Minister of Finance, comes from a Conservative party. He's also the leader of that party. He owned, or he was one of 3 owners of a Seychelles company, invested in property in Dubai. Also, another interesting story is that after this government came into power, the tax authorities were offered to buy a league, and the Minister of Finance didn't sort of actively support it, and it took quite a while, but in the end it did. The tax authorities did buy this leaked documents. Obviously, one of the things that has been sort of revised now that people know that the Minister of Finance actually owned an offshore company is that he didn't seem to be very actively interested in buying this document. So there's a lot of things. Once you know what these politicians were up to, people obviously revise their words. Now, the effect of offshoreization is the usual things. It's tax evasion, hidden ownership, listed companies where one didn't really know about who owned it and who was buying with whom, hidden control, as the Landsbanki example, misleading information regarding ownership on the whole, and then what I've called the centrifuge of debt and assets. So if you have a whole cluster of companies on an offshore, you can move money around. And there have been absolutely spectacular bankruptcies where the debt is absolutely humongous and there are no assets. And obviously the offshoreization has been useful there. So this is Iceland is, as I say, it's a small economy. So the effect has been enormous, and I think much greater than you would sense necessarily in bigger countries. So are Icelanders now understanding all of this much better, and the Icelandic politicians? Well, one of the ministers, who is actually now a prime minister, he said when all of this came up, about Vintris and the Panama Papers, he said, it's difficult to own money in Iceland. And you just wonder, Iceland lost 90% of its banking system in 3 days. Now, if that wasn't a lesson, I just wonder what on earth could be a lesson. Thank you.
Thank you, Sigrun, and thank you most of all for staying to time, which is my primary concern. And now I will get the presentation to you, Richard.
Thanks.
You can stay from there if you want.
Yeah, I'll do that. Morning all. Right, this is a story about one particular secrecy vehicle that we have onshore in the UK that's got suddenly shown up as having big offshore connections, and it's a thing called the Scottish Limited Partnership. Now, this crops up in this huge scam story that broke at the end of 2014, I suppose. Someone removed from Malden Bank nearly $1 billion once you roll in the interest, and moved it offshore. The money seems to have been spirited away into Latvian banks, and after that, no one really knows where it went. Various fingers have been pointed at who did it. Again, people in Moldova, people in Russia. No one really knows. It caused uproar. That's a huge hit to that year's GDP. It's about 12 to 15% of Malden GDP. It's a tiny little country. It's got 3.5 million inhabitants. It's not at all industrialised. They're they run vineyards and farms and that kind of thing. And it's in a very sort of uncomfortable location, right in between Romania, which is thought of as a European country these days, and Ukraine, which is very disputed indeed, I suppose, between the sort of pro-Europe section and the pro-Russia section. Some of that goes on in Moldova as well. Historically, the Moldovan banks and courts have been massively abused in black money flows. The estimates of the amount of money that gets shoveled through the Moldovan banking system and Moldovan courts ranges between $20 billion and $80 billion over the last 5 years, 10 years, I suppose. And it's clearly part of a very big piece of the sort of post-Soviet Union money movement architecture, if I can put it like that. Anyway, yes, so they blew up this bank, and there was political uproar. In May 2015, the Kroll Investigations, who are a big investigations firm staffed by ex-policemen, ex-spooks and all sorts, wrote up a report which was promptly leaked by the Speaker of the Moldovan Parliament, and suddenly some of the scam mechanism was revealed, and about half of the shell companies involved, there were something like 100 of them, turned out to be based not anywhere near Moldova, but in the UK. So we had limited companies. One of them was provided by Mossack Fonseca's subsidiary in the UK, but there were a load of other companies involved. There were limited liability partnerships, there were limited partnerships from Northern Ireland, and there were Scottish limited partnerships, which were kind of a new entry in the sort of shell company field. So in an effort to cut down, you can't talk about 48 shell companies in a radio program and keep everyone sane. So they did a sort of dive into the story in File 4, and they looked at just one limited partnership, a thing called Fortuna United LP. It's got a company service provider up in Scotland, Royston Business Consultancy, which is controlled by 2 Lithuanians who live up there. The limited partnership has a minimum of 2 partners, always, by law. One is the general partner who controls the company and operates the business. The other is the limited partner. Typically they put up the working capital for the firm and take a share of profits, but they don't typically have a role in the day-to-day operation of the company. Now, the way Fortuna worked, its 2 partners were in fact offshore companies incorporated in the Seychelles. So at first look, it's impossible to tell who really controls Fortuna. On a second look, it turned out to be the companies involved turned out to be controlled by, in the first instance, by Royston Business Consultancy. So they've done this elaborate wheeze whereby they hid their own control of the partnership offshore. Obviously, the ultimate controller of the company is or the partnership is someone else altogether, and they've never really said who that was. The money from this huge fraud went off to various Latvian banks, and one that was followed up in the radio program was Privat Bank, which is actually a subsidiary of the Ukrainian bank, controlled by one of the oligarchs there, a chap called Kolomoisky. The BBC journalist interviewed a lady called Ivana Kerper, about Privat Bank, and not only did she say we haven't done anything wrong, she sort of added, by the way, we don't think it's really a fraud either. So that's how it is over there. You can nick $800 million from a bank, and one of the main money channels doesn't think there's anything wrong with it. That bit of stonewalling fell over about 3 months ago when she was removed from the operation of the bank, along with the whole of the board, by the Latvian regulator. Now, as I said, it's one company, but the background to it is way bigger than that. We've got a whole bunch of company service providers in the UK who have the same dodgy client who did this huge fraud, 5 of them. We've also got a whole bunch of what are obviously company service providers offshore. Now, they don't have to register with the UK's money laundering authority at all. They can just go and register companies, which is kind of mad. If you think your company service provider is worth controlling, then you control all of them, not just the ones that happen to be based in the UK. Some of the obvious company service providers, you can't even tell who they are from the documentation that's available in Companies House. So nobody knows who's doing it. You can tell they're connected with Panama and Belize and places like that, but it's pretty hard to pin down who they are. Then there are the address providers. All these limited partnerships and companies and so on need a place of business or a registered office in the UK, and typically those are just mail drops. In the case of the Moldova scam, there's some pretty odd mail drops. There are commercial businesses that provide this as a sort of service, little shops, but the Moldovan ones, you had places on terrible rundown council estates that were hosting 500 companies, 1,000 companies. So, there's some poor bloke there collecting a bit of pin money by providing his address as a place of business. And there are 2 more banks involved, the Latvian Post Bank and ABLV. I don't know anything much about Post Bank. ABLV, though, is quite big. It's had connections in the past with other big money laundering exploits. The Latvia regulator is still sniffing at that one, but they haven't actually done anything actively to see what they do, because this is quite a big bank. Right, so sort of pulling out from that a bit, we've got this problem in the UK with our opaque partnerships. The basic idea is that you appoint 2 partners to the business that are actually companies in secrecy jurisdictions somewhere. And looking at the database, looking at the company register, these are the sort of typical places where you find them. Just a quick list: Anguilla, Belize, BVI, Dominica, which is not called Dominica, it's attached to Haiti, it's a tiny little island of its own. The Marshall Islands, Panama, St. Kitts, Vanuatu, Seychelles. Now there's a sort of mix there of UK overseas territories and just off the map places like the Seychelles and the Marshall Islands. The sort of common factor is that you can use the limited partnership framework or the limited liability partnership framework as a sort of wrapper. You can bring all your offshore secrecy onshore. So you've got what looks like it ought to be a respectable UK company, but is in fact might as well be a Panamanian one or a Belizean one or whatever, where they don't tell you who the directors are, who controls it. And that's how it works. It all started in about 2008 with just one company. I've got the slides out of sequence here. Excuse me a moment while I mess around. Okay, I'll have to make that slide up. It all started in 2008. A big offshore company service provider suddenly noticed that you could do all the same things with limited partnerships that you could do with limited liability partnerships. It had the extra attraction that at that time the register wasn't online, so it was all done on paper and it was all pretty much invisible and off the radar. That started a boom. They all started copying each other. It's quite interesting that obviously the offshore people talk to each other about what's new and hot and exciting in the world of opacity vehicles. And by September last year, this is what had happened. There were 13,000 of these things. They had 25 addresses in Scotland, usually mail drops, sometimes these funny council houses that I mentioned. There are a couple of mail drops there that have thousands of Scottish limited partnerships registered there, or with their place of business there. If you turn up there, you'll just find some, mildly eccentric people living in a tidy or less tidy Scottish address, and they won't know a damn thing about what's going on with these things. Registrations currently running about 400 a month, these things being created. 9 out of 10 of them have this hallmark of having overseas partners somewhere. There is still a perfectly legitimate business, and it's completely outnumbered by these passive vehicles. But for instance, lawyers active in the financial services sector in Edinburgh are quite fond of these things. The World Bank has got one. There are a few based in the Channel Islands. So you've got this kind of ordinary financial services business going on alongside this stuff that looks just profoundly dubious. When you look on the web for who's trying to push Scottish limited partnerships, you find that they're basically advertised by websites based in the former Soviet Union, big swathe all the way through the Baltics, Belarus, in Russia itself, and in the Ukraine. In Ukraine, it's particularly interesting. They're actually marketed as a way to dodge around the edicts that flowed out of Poroshenko's government, which were trying to stamp out corruption. So the Scottish limited partnership is advertised as a sort of respectable alternative to a company in Panama or whatever. In fact, as you can see, it just hides the company in Panama behind the Scottish limited partnership facade. So in a way, our laws over here are undermining the efforts to, which are pretty half-hearted, I must say, in Ukraine, to stamp out corruption. So who's doing it? There are a few places where you can trace who's involved. There's an accounting firm called Axiano, which has a related company called Lawsuits there in Edinburgh. Their name is cropped up as the provider of companies involved in more than money laundering. The OCCRP did a big study on that a couple of years ago, traced 20 billion of fake debts run up by Russian companies to companies in Scotland. That was, the debts were enforced in the Malden courts, so the Russian companies had, quote, to hand over the money to the Scottish ones. That moves the money offshore. Now, there's no suggestion in any of this that Lawson's or Axiana had the faintest idea that that's how their companies were being used, but that's how they were used. Companies Plus, they're in London. Their name crops up as the formation agents for Ukrainian oligarchs and as the provider of shelter used in Ukrainian bid rigging. There was a celebrated case of an oil rig, an exploration rig, which was worth about $150 million. There was a competitive bid for that, I think, and the company that eventually bought it, or the Ukrainian government, I should say, bought it for $400 million. So $250 million went off somewhere.
Just stay check in 5 minutes.
Sure, that's correct. Aaron, another agent. Their companies have turned up in a big copyright theft. Last year, HMRC and FACT, the copyright protection people, raided some of their offices in Scotland, or visited, should we say, their offices in Scotland. I doubt very much whether they'll have found anything there. The address used by Aaron crops up in a UN report 5 years ago now, I suppose, something like that, about arms smuggling to the Ivory Coast. So, yeah, Edinburgh's a bit more exotic than you thought. There's all sorts of things going on. Right, now the offshore people. Carney Curran, they're an Irish agent. They often work with a really notorious overseas, I'll call them an agent operator, called International Overseas Services. They come up again and again and again in connection with fraud and money laundering in the former Soviet Union. Again, you know, all they did was supply the companies. I'm not saying they did anything wrong, but 5 billion came out of BGA Bank in, I think, Kazakhstan, if I remember correctly, via iOS companies. You've got more arms smugglers. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, you've got the CIA rendition program. They, when they were sort of kidnapping people and whisking them away to waterboard them, they built a little sort of torture room in Lithuania. And they paid the guys who built this thing via companies supplied by International Overseas Services, which had an office in Virginia at the time. So it's all in one big jumbled mess. The spooks are in there, the fraudsters are in there, arms smugglers are in there. Wonderful. Now, the other offshore player that crops up in the mold of a scam is this, what I've called the Maharal / Cyprus outfit. It's very diffuse. The guy in Maharal doesn't do it anymore. He got out of it 5 years ago. But he's obviously got inheritors. One of the places, again, that name crops up is this Russian laundering machine thing that the OCCRP did. That turns out to be both the Magnitsky fraud, which is, I imagine you know about that, that's Hermitage Capital, Bill Browder's investment vehicle, suddenly found that $230 million had been stolen from the Russian exchequer as a tax fraud in the name of Hermitage. So the Russians have gone after Browder. His accountant ended up in Russian prison, where either he was beaten to death or died of neglect. So he's been on a sort of anti-Putin crusade ever since. His investigation work of the underlying shell companies is just, it's really good. But he's obviously taking a big risk. Tangling with Putin like that. Right, what have I got, 3 minutes?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, right. Quick whiz. Company service providers are a big piece of why offshore goes haywire. Here's the thing. They build all these structures that are perfectly suited for money laundering, but they typically see and hear no evil whatsoever. Last year, 350,000 suspicious activity reports, 177 of them from company service providers. Now, looking at the Scottish LPs and the LLPs, you've got something like 20,000 of them with this secrecy configuration. To me, that's 20,000 suspicious activity reports gone missing. More realistically, the boys in this game, their entire business is suspicious activity. That's what they do. So it's pretty unlikely they're going to report it. The policing of company service providers in the UK is sort of so extravagantly awful, it's hard to believe they're not just pulling our legs. There are about 27, 28 agencies entrusted with the anti-money laundering. About 20 of them seem to have some involvement in policing company service providers, but it's all fragmented. You know, some of them are lawyers, some of them are tax advisors, some of them just form companies, and no one knows where the cracks are. There's one bloody enormous crack, and that's the offshore company service provider. They aren't policed at all. So anyone can rock up and register a shell company and not leave enough information behind for anyone to be able to tell who they really are. It's mad. Zooming out a bit further, the law is out of date on limited partnerships. The law on limited liability partnerships is defective. Companies House doesn't have the money, and it also doesn't have the mission statement. They say their job is to promote trust in UK companies, but they just transcribe the information that anyone from anywhere deigns to throw their way. So they're not checking anything. The Insolvency Service, which is our sort of knacker's yard for dodgy companies, doesn't have any legal powers to strike off or investigate limited partnerships. There are some Scottish powers, but they're completely ineffective. You can go and raid the council house in Inverness if you want to. You won't find anything there. It's just a registered place of business. It's a formality. It doesn't mean there's anyone there who knows anything at all about what's going on with that company. So none of that works. So how would you sort that out? One idea is this ultimate beneficial owner disclosure. I don't think it works if you've got thresholds. One of the big moving parts of the mold of the scam, 20 UK shell companies each took 4.99% control of a Malden bank. The reason why they did that is that the disclosure threshold is 5%. So they didn't have to tell the regulator anything at all about what they were up to until they'd taken control of the bank. So putting a threshold on UBO disclosure is a waste of time. Unfortunately, that's the exact waste of time that we've got coming with LLPs and probably LPs as well. It's set at 25%. All you need to do if you're an offshore agent is appoint 3 more nominee directors to your general partner in Belize. In fact, you probably don't even need to do that. So that won't work. You could get rid of limited partnerships, corporate members. You could say they have to be real people. That might work. There are going to be a few snags with the financial services sector. The world banks, limited partnership might need to have an exception made for it. There'll be a few more like that. It might work. But we really need to get a grip of the company service providers and make sure their anti-money laundering's up to snuff. And it would be really good to be able to strike these things off. I'm not holding my breath for any of that to happen, judging by the way that UK legislation fumbles around with these issues, we'll be waiting for a long time for any of this to happen, if it happens at all. Oh, one last thought. If you're going home via the Barbican, on your way past, just before you get to the Barbican station, you'll see mailboxes, etc. That's the registered place of business of about 100 English limited partnerships and limited liability partnerships. A quick look at the register shows that their partners are in St Kitts and Nevis, Panama, Belize. So if you want a quick look at offshore, have a look at mailboxes, etc. on your way home. 10 minutes walk, that's where offshore is, right here. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard. Well, we had quite a hard finish today because we've got some timing issues with our satellite link that we're going to have after this. And so I'm going to ask Nick to respond for 10 minutes if you could maximum, which breaks our hard finish, but flexibility. And then we're not going to have questions because this is a small enough group that you can catch them outside during the break if you have a desperate to ask questions, because we need to, it's satellite time is very expensive, so we can't. So Nick.
Thanks for those absolutely fascinating presentations, very engagingly delivered. When I wrote a book about tax havens, treasure islands, where I didn't put very much about crime in there, and that was kind of deliberate, just because at the time there was a perception, a widespread perception, that these were just places for mafiosi and criminals and stuff. I wanted to make the point that this was a much bigger story. I wasn't trying to make the point that crime wasn't important. It's clearly incredibly important, to the central part of the whole system. But I wanted to portray this as a broad economic phenomenon that is one of the great fault lines in financial globalization. So, and these two presentations about very different issues in very different places do have common threads. And for me, I think one of the most important common threads here is financial stability. This is a theme that we at the Tax Justice Network have been interested in for a long time, the role of offshore and tax havens in financial stability. In treasure islands, my main kind of interest in this area was, I took a very broad view of what offshore is, what a tax haven is, going way beyond tax. And I kind of boiled it down to two words. One is escape, and the other one is elsewhere. You kind of go elsewhere or take your assets elsewhere to escape whatever rules and laws you don't like. And I spent quite a lot of time writing about how Wall Street used the City of London in particular, the emerging euro markets, Eurodollar markets, as a kind of unregulated space where they could escape financial regulations, rules that they didn't like, things that were crimping their pockets at home. They found they could come to London and do these things in London. And if you actually look back over the history of the recent global financial crisis, a lot of the shenanigans that were kind of the kernel of the really big collapses were in London or linked to London. So AIG, biggest collapse in world history, was most importantly by a unit in Curzon Street in Mayfair, with 300, 400 people working there. I think it is important, if we want to think about tax havens conceptually, it is important to think of them as a very central structural component of the global economy that affects us in so many different ways, in so many different areas. And Richard, you described this as one big jumbled mess, and it kind of, in a sense, it is. It's a big jumbled, chaotic mess. And so we, as the Tax Justice Network, as I said to a different group last night, we try to look at this in terms of, we're trying to get people interested in these issues and getting engaged in these issues. And we try to always look at it in terms of different communities of people. Who are we going to look at next? So I think the first groups that really got it, as far as we were concerned, were the development NGOs, and we kind of moved on to trade unions, and we're interested in human rights communities. I think there's a huge financial stability community out there. That there are some links there. There is some academic interest in the relationship between offshore and this kind of racial wealth dynamics between countries that helps create offshore. These links are kind of tentative. I think we do need to do a lot more building of links between the tax justice community and folks interested in financial stability issues, because there is a huge and hugely important fields to be covered, important terrain to be covered. So, and both of your presentations, the collapse of a bank with huge implications in Moldova, and obviously the Iceland story, are also very, financial stability is a big part of these stories. And this idea of one big jumbled mess, it's obviously many different things. So I think this is, we are still in the foothills of understanding where all these ramifications go. I think one message that really ought to come away from this session and this event more generally is the size and scale and the reach and multifaceted nature of this phenomenon that we're grappling with here. One other observation about Richard's presentation, you kept mentioning these jurisdictions like the Martian Islands, Kitts and Nevis, Vanuatu, Seychelles, and Panama goes in that group as well. I think it is interesting that the offshore world is a kind of ecosystem of different places that provide different things. So Ireland, for example, is a place where, which is really about, from an offshore perspective, it's about corporate tax shenanigans. But it's not really a secret, it's not where you go to get secrecy. And in fact, they have some very good disclosure of company information in Ireland. Switzerland is secrecy plus quite a wide variety of other things. Luxembourg is secrecy plus corporate tax and fund management and stuff. Cayman Islands, a lot of private equity, fund management, hedge funds. But all of these places are kind of rich countries, or in the case of the Cayman Islands, dependencies of rich countries, Britain in this case. But these smaller places that we're talking about, including Panama, kind of have much more of a developing country feel. And so they are, this is kind of, it's an interesting grouping of tax havens where each tax haven has to decide what its selling point is. And if you don't have the reassuring bedrock of being a rich, trusted country like Switzerland, when I say trusted, I mean trusted by the people who are going to use you, not by the people who are victims of those people. And you don't have the bedrock of the British court system as you have in places like the Cayman Islands, then you're going to have to look for something else. And so I think this is one explanation why Panama in particular, but these other smaller places have. It's just a business model. That's the business model they're pushed towards. Because they have this developing country image, they can't go for hedge funds and private equity and all this lucrative stuff. They have to go for secrecy and turning a blind eye and taking very dirty money. So it's just another kind of observation about the ecosystem that is offshore, the constantly shifting octopus that we're grappling with. I think octopus kind of is too small when you think about it. There's a creature we've got many more tentacles, but that's kind of what we're grappling with. So it's a fascinating political economy story. I think I'm going to kind of stop there because I think we have. Do we have time for any questions that we?
Can I just add one more thing? I totally agree with you about the financial stability, and I think it's incredibly important. I mean, for central bankers and others who deal with that to understand that this is not something exotic that excited journalists like to talk about. My sort of image is, you have a country which is sort of like a big balloon, but inside this balloon there is actually, and you think that all of this balloon is regulated, and it's all equally regulated. But then what offshore creates, it creates a free space from the law and order, from the social pact on taxation, and so on. So for a certain people, they can live in the wonderful law and order society that we all like to live in, but then they have their own free space where they can operate as if there were no law and order. And this is hugely destabilizing, and it's hugely dangerous. So I think it's great that you focus on the financial stability.
Yeah, I think so it directly undermines democracy, directly undermines
absolutely,
And this kind of free space, and this goes with the word escape. Central to offshore, and also you do find offshore a very kind of libertarian mindset of the laws shouldn't apply to us. We don't like rules. We don't like regulations. We don't like taxes.
Exactly, and it's so exactly
firms that work for their clients. They propagate this thing when the BBC rings them up to an interview. They have this mindset. And it kind of spreads, and it's spreading into all of our society.
Exactly, and it's spreading, and it's so upsetting that these people, they choose to live in London. They don't want to live in, Panama or wherever. They like London because it has all that, a functioning democracy has to offer, but yet they operate on in this free space that they have created outside of law and order. Hugely upsetting.
Right, thank you very much. No, I'm not afraid we can't have any questions because, like all good Democrats, the moment I have power, I crush democracy. If I ever get elected to anything, then it's going to be used against me. But thank you very much. We're about to move on to the presentation of the awards for the human rights. So if you could thank our panel.
So hi everybody, my name is Liz Nelson, I work with the Tax Justice Network, and so we've got quite a short session here, which is half an hour, where we're going to talk about the essay competition that we've run with Oxfam GB. I'm pleased that Nick Breyer, from Head of Inequality Campaigns and Policy, is with us from Oxfam. And further on my left is Megan Jones, who I'll introduce a bit more in a moment, who's one of our prize winners. So we've also got the other prize winner who will, we hope, fingers crossed, be joining us by Skype and give his presentation by Skype. So we'll just see how the sound goes. We have done extensive testing yesterday. So let's see. So I just want to hand over to Nick first to just talk about our work together briefly, and then I'll give a short explanation of actually what we asked Megan and Apple to do as part of this essay competition.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for having us here. So I think everyone's here because we don't think that tax is just academically interesting, but because we recognise that fair and effective tax systems at a national or global level could be one of the greatest tools we have in the fight against poverty, in the fight against inequality, in the fight for fairer, better economies and societies. And because we know that the kind of tax system that we've just heard described by the previous panel is doing the opposite and is entrenching those inequalities and increasing poverty and creating worse societies and worse economies. So Oxfam works on tax, and we work a lot with the Tax Justice Network, not just because we want to understand what's going on, but because we want to change it. And we're always talking together, and we work on a variety of different things together in the UK and around the world, looking for new approaches, new ideas that could help us tackle the injustices that we see in the tax system. And so comparatively recently, we found ourselves talking about human rights dimension and exploring that and whether we could do more to go down that route. And that led us on to thinking about who might help us with that and who might have the ideas and the experience, the talent and the creativity to help us explore those kind of avenues. And so we thought we'd try and tap into the world's legal minds. And that led to this idea for jointly running an essay competition, which is what we're now here to present the outcomes of.
Thanks, Nick. So what we, sort of back in March or February, what we did was we asked entrants to prepare 3,500 words to basically construct a human rights complaint that would identify the plaintiffs, the defendants, remedies sought, and arguments that are enforceable in an existing legal forum. So we particularly sought complaints that would form the basis of effective advice to developing countries, or to groups of citizens in countries at any income level who have suffered. So we wanted to understand how the plaintiff could best use the law to protect their or their people's human rights in the face of tax injustice. So that was the task. The judging panel was chaired by Magdalena Sepulveda, who's a senior research fellow at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. And from 2008 to 2014 was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. So she chaired our panel. John Christensen, TJN Executive Director, was also on the panel, along with Josh Saunders, who's the counsel to Oxfam GB. So our two winners, let me just start with our first winner. And so we had two categories, a professional category and a student category. So I'm pleased to introduce Megan Jones, who the winner of our student category. I haven't got a big bouquet or a medal or anything, but we're delighted that you've come all the way, in fact, from Queensland University. In Australia. So Megan is a PhD candidate at Queensland's University of Technology in Australia, and prior to starting her PhD, she consulted on human rights matters to UNICEF in Nepal and spent several years in London working on international taxation. So I'm going to hand over to you, Megan. Congratulations. Thank you for being with us. And then we'll get back to Abdul, who will get on stage.
Okay, so good morning everyone, and thank you to Oxfam and the Tax Justice Network for having me here today. So I'll just take you quickly through my paper, which was Tax Havens in an Emergency Nepal Crisis. So just a quick background to the human rights and tax situation in Nepal, and then the complaint itself. So there was a pretty major event in Nepal last year, which you might have seen in the media this week, because it was the 1-year anniversary of the Nepal earthquake, which did cause major devastation in the country. So I can vouch for that because I was living there at the time. So what happened? Over 600,000 homes were destroyed, and 1 year on, there's still hundreds of thousands of people still living in temporary accommodation. So the situation worsened there towards the end of last year, where their constitution was promulgated. So, and that took about 7 years to take place. And the problem with that was just that there were some minority groups protesting along the border area with India because they felt their rights weren't adequately included, and that led to an unofficial blockade by India, which made it more difficult for supplies to get into Nepal. So essentially there was a lot of economic, social and cultural rights at risk, which are internationally set out in the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ICESCA. But essentially what I'm talking about is the need for funding here for housing. So $4 billion was pledged to Nepal following the earthquake, but it's estimated that an additional $3 billion is still needed. And that's quite important for a country like Nepal because it is a developing country suffering from poverty and inequality. So in terms of the tax situation, taxes make up about 15% of GDP. There's quite a high proportion of indirect taxes, which can be regressive in nature and therefore discriminatory against poorer citizens. But what I actually wrote about was the outcome of the Swiss Leaks report. So it was found that money had been held in Swiss bank accounts with HSBC by Nepali citizens. And it was thought that some tax evasion had been occurring there. The Panama Papers have now come out since I wrote this. No Nepalis have been named yet, but it has been noted that there's been an increase in recent years of foreign direct investment from tax haven countries into Nepal. So it could be that that's from illegal funds held offshore by Nepali citizens. So what was the complaint then? So I've just argued that certain rights have been breached. And just firstly that tax evasion is taking place. Because of this, maximum available resources are not being utilised or raised to fund human rights. So specifically the right to an adequate standard of living set out in ICESCA, and that includes housing, and also the right to housing, which is in the Constitution. So then the plaintiff is just the citizens still living in temporary shelter following the earthquake, and the defendant is the government of Nepal. So what was the legal basis for the complaint? That was probably the most difficult thing in this. So I've just said that a complaint can be made under the National Human Rights Commissions Act. There's no option to make a complaint internationally by citizens. So even though Nepal has ratified ICESCA, it's not a party to the optional protocol, which allows for international complaints by citizens. So then domestic complaints need to be looked at. There's a right to constitutional remedy where rights are breached, but that's not applicable in this case. But the Constitution also sets out that a National Human Rights Commission can exist to promote human rights in Nepal. And what that commission has the ability to do is conduct inquiries and investigations where rights are violated, and they can also make recommendations to the government of Nepal. So that complaint can be made by a victim or a person on their behalf to the commission. So the main arguments then, under ICESCA, states are required to take steps to the maximum of their available resources to achieve progressively economic, social and cultural rights. And something similar is also mentioned in the Constitution of Nepal. But then what makes up those resources? Tax revenue can be a component of maximum available resources. So where tax evasion occurs, that's reducing those potential resources that could be available. And where the government is not taking action against that tax evasion, then that's still occurring. So as I said, because this has not been addressed by the Nepali government to date, the resources are not available to fund these economic, social and cultural rights. And because of this situation, inequality is also being promoted. So equality is a key principle within human rights instruments as well. And this situation can be entrenched further by regressive taxes, which I just noted at the start, exist in Nepal as well. So the proposed remedy then is to submit a complaint to the National Human Rights Commission in Nepal to investigate the case and for them to make recommendations to the government of Nepal. So I think the main issue is probably obtaining more information. That could be done potentially by signing up to the Common Reporting Standard. But as Nepal is a developing country, just would need to keep in mind the capacity and IT requirements and so on. And also there is a level of, I guess, corruption and maybe whether there's political will to follow this up or use the information. But definitely something needs to be done there. And finally then, just potentially the tax system could be reviewed as to whether those weighting towards regressive taxes could be changed at all. But overall, the goal is just to obtain greater resources, hopefully through the tax system, to fund human rights. Thank you.
So just before we move on to Giovanni, we'll just try and start setting up for Abdul. Although I said that we didn't have a medal or a bunch of flowers or a box of chocolates. What we do have is a book. Oh, thank you. So John signed this book. He's been a bit shy about presenting it to you, but so on behalf of Oxfam TJN, thank you very much, Meg. Thank you. And obviously we'll arrange for that to be sent to Abdul. So let me just say a few words while Giovanni's setting this up. So Abdul was the winner, Abdul Chowdhury was the winner of our professional category. And Abdul is a legislative aide to be Vinod Kumar, who's a member of parliament in India. So I won't go into the detail of Abdul's presentation, but we're delighted he's with us. So I'm going to, Abdul, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon.
Okay, so you have 10 minutes, Abdul, so I'll just hand over to you and let us know if, and we'll let you know if we're having any problems, and vice versa.
Okay, is the present on?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, great to see you. I wish I could be there in person, but well, you know. So my presentation is on child rights and tax justice in India, tackling ETA and P-note. We'll get to what these mysterious abbreviations mean in just a moment. So on the screen, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a map of the world. Is that available? Is that visible?
We are setting the presentation.
I'm sorry?
Setting it up now. Yes.
Okay. It's on?
It's on.
Okay, so you can see the map of the world and the title?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, so that's the map of the world, and my complaint, the issue is basically based in India. It's about child rights and tax justice in India. So let's go there. Next slide, please. Has it gone to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, fine. So yeah, good old India is a country with a lot of people, a lot of kids, and not enough money. And when I say a lot of kids, I mean a lot of kids. There's 442 million children in India. That's about 40% of the population. And to put that number in perspective, that's equal to the entire population of Germany, France, UK, Italy, Spain, and all of those other countries which you can see on the list. So it's a huge number of people that we're talking about. And in my complaint, I'm focusing on two aspects of these children's life. That's the right to education and the right to be protected against child labor. Next slide, please.
Yes.
Okay, so you can see some Indian children, they're fairly representative, and believe me, they're as interested in you as you are in them. So next slide, please. Okay, now some basic statistics about the condition of children's education in India. 60% of them approximately don't complete primary school, about 90% don't complete school at all, and only 10% want to join college. So a lot of these children, they unsurprisingly become child laborers. And as per official statistics, India has 10 million child laborers, which is again the population of either Sweden or Portugal. And unofficial statistics put this number at about 16 million. And this is really something that sets off the cycle of poverty which carries on over generations, because these child laborers remain poor because they're unable to move up in life, and they have a lot of children, and these children cannot be educated, and so this continues across generations. So this is poverty which carries through generations because of their inability to get education as children. The Indian Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi has spent his whole life campaigning against this phenomenon. So let's see what he has to say about it. Next slide, please. Yeah, please play the video from 2 minutes and 39 seconds.
This is essential for children to. Child labour infringes on all of these rights.
Unfortunately, we have the largest number of child labor in the world. At least 60 million children, according to non-governmental statistics, are still working in various forms of child labor. So it's a serious problem. But when we talk of child labor in India, about 70% of these children are working in agriculture sector, in fields and farms and rural economy, and rest are working in construction industry like stone mining, quarries, brick kilns, and then small scale industries everywhere. Then you can find quite a large number of children working in household activities like domestic child labor. And then you can find children working in street restaurants and entertainment industries all across India. I'm representing here because of poverty.
Okay, next slide, please.
Friends,
This is 3 minutes and 7 seconds.
Yeah.
no greater violence than to deny the dreams of our children. Therefore, I refuse to accept that all the temples and mosques and churches and prayer houses have no place for the dreams of our children. I refuse to accept that the world is so poor when just 1 week of military expenditure can bring all the children to classrooms. I refuse to accept that all the laws and constitutions and police and judges are unable to protect our children. I refuse to accept that the shackles of slavery can ever be more stronger than the quest for freedom. I refuse to accept here.
Yes.
Okay, so Mr. Satyarthi, next slide please. So Mr. Satyarthi has put it much better than I have put, and the point which he makes about the law not being able to protect the rights of the children is really where we can begin to address this issue. And here's where the link comes to Act Justice and Freedom. So as we keep
We can barely hear you now. Could you please speak slower?
Okay. So as Mr. said, this is a violation of their rights, which is enshrined in various domestic laws, and which is a violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which India has ratified. Next slide, please. Have you reached the silent violation of UNCRC?
We are in violation of domestic laws.
Next one. Okay, now here comes, now it's very obvious that the government has not been able to uphold the rights of these children. So the question comes that what has been the main role of the state so far? Next slide. And we feel that the government has been basically a budgetary slasher. It's been ruthlessly hacking away at the sources dedicated, which should have been directed to the state for only. And let's see some statistics. Next slide. Okay, so time is short, so I won't go into the details, but the basic point is the application is made to the state.
Sorry, could you repeat this slide about the slasher stats? We didn't get that.
Okay. So since time is short, I won't go into the details. But the basic point is that the allocation which has been made to the budget, to the government to uphold these child rights has been simply inadequate. And it has been reducing over time. Now, the government's standard response is that it does not have the resources which are required, does not have adequate resources. But The truth is that we have plenty of resources and plenty of sources of resources which could tap into. And it is willfully decided not to tap into these tax revenue sources and has taken steps to encourage tax revenue. So let's look at two of these. Next level. Okay, so we are back to the map of India. Now, if you are an Indian rich person, then you won't be very different from a rich person in any other part of the world. And if you have a lot of money, here's what you do with it. Next step. Well, diving around in a lot of money like a Popeyes sounds definitely enjoyable, and rich people just love to see that paying taxes is definitely not what is the top of their agenda. And they think of all sorts of ways to hide their money. And we'll be looking at two steps which they have taken, which is the decision.
You want to Mauritius? Please speak louder.
The first one is double taxation avoidance agreements, which the government of India has signed with Mauritius and Singapore. As per this, capital gains tax will be levied on a company only in the place where it is registered. Now, Mauritius and Singapore do not levy capital gains tax, and India it does have short-term capital gains tax, but it's quite less. So what generally happens is that companies that have shell companies in Mauritius or Singapore, and because of the double taxation avoidance agreements, they don't pay capital gains tax in either country. So both countries leave up to the companies to completely escape paying capital gains tax, and that leads to a significant revenue loss. The second thing is that these two countries help a lot of round tripping, money laundering. In India, there is a popular network called Vala, which is an informal network through which hard cash is laundered abroad. Once it goes out of the country and goes mainly to Mauritius, it becomes laundered and it comes back to the country in the form of foreign direct investment. And a study was done, and it showed that Mauritius and Singapore were the two biggest, both of which are well-known tax havens, were the two biggest sources of FDI of India. And the amount of money that has been lost is huge. $93.6 billion have come in the last 2 years to two countries from Mauritius alone, and from Singapore it brings $43 billion. So we can only imagine the amount of tax revenue which has been lost. The government of India has set up a committee to dispute the tax agreement with Mauritius, but it said that it might be double taxation agreement might be around next time. This is the second instrument which the government has, the second policy decision they have taken which allows tax reviews. This is a financial instrument called T-note. It's got a very technical definition, we believe, which can be quite various. But what it really means is that anonymous people can invest money in the stock market. And this has been used by all sorts of shady characters to bring their ill-gotten wealth back into India. And at the peak in 2007, it constituted 50% of the value of outstanding FPI assets. The government has heightened the execution of that it will not get this. So, even this makes it. Now, these two decisions, public taxation, balance agreement, and some package, they are very huge amount of revenue loss. And it's a self-repeating activity, it's a self-applicating activity. But it's quite obvious that you should get rid of this earlier. But despite repeated efforts, the government has acted. And this brings my message. And IDJ India, where the foreign in Hindi, where you say that you're doing yourself giving this. So I just wanted to share it next slide, please.
We're on it.
Right. So that's a metaphor for doing something really harmful to yourself and not listening to reason. That's what the government of India has been doing. And finally, they have to be taken to the court. So in the complaint, plaintiff is any public spirited person who can represent the children of India, the defendant, the government of India, and here are some of the things you can seek from. Next slide. Okay, so some of the remedies which should be sought from the defendant, banning of all PNOs, no more foreign institutional investment unless we know who is bringing the money inside, a court-monitored investigation, so we know the beneficial owners of the PNOs which are already in the market. Every Indian citizen should disclose details of the assets that are brought as well as direct or indirect shareholdings of money in foreign companies. And most important, and this is something which is thankfully picked up a lot of extra, is that we need to have a public registry of beneficial ownership of companies, trusts, and other corporations. And finally, the government of India should see Article 15 as double taxation of violent agreement and punishment. If that happens, hopefully a lot more activities can be used, a lot more tools can be built, teachers can be hired, training can be provided, infrastructure can be created, and the children of India will be able to hopefully say next section. Thank you.
Abdul, thanks very much for that. Two really interesting different case studies showing how different states are unable to fill their human rights obligations. So both really different but interesting nonetheless. Abdul, just while you, I'll just check how long if we've got time for any questions. Just stay on the line for a moment. I was saying to Ben, we haven't got a medal or a cup or flowers to send to you, but we will get our latest publication from TJN called Greatest Invention, and John will kindly sign that and we'll send that to you. And we're very sorry that you couldn't be with us because of the visa requirements. So anyway, do we have, I'm looking here to Alex, but do you feel like we could have a couple of questions? Yes, we can have a go. So are there any, stay on the line up, are there any questions or comments, thoughts?
I have a question which goes back to 1215 with Magna Carta, because in Canada we have a story very much like this, where the lawsuit is challenging the no taxation without representation issue. And I happen to be involved in this case. But is there a comparison that you feel, especially in your case, at Maximum Resource? I see that kind of relationship. Would you please comment on it?
So if there's a comparison?
If there's a comparison between the human right to the maximum resource from the tax base compared to the long-standing Magna Carta, which says no taxation without representation. Because of the fraud in the tax system, you don't know what the tax base really is. So you can't even get a maximum, even if you...
Yeah, I mean, I think my comment on that would really just...
Can somebody repeat them?
Just one moment, Abdul.
Yes. My question is basically relating to the historic archaic banking system and the human rights with the Magna Carta. In Canada, we're challenging that through the courts, where no taxation without representation is something that is a complaint, and the plaintiff is saying that there is no maximum tax available to Canadians because there is fraud in the system and the tax base is an imaginary figure. lower than would normally be available to Canadians to enjoy the tax benefit. So my question is, it was the words at the presentation about the Australian situation, sorry, Nepal situation, was the human right to maximum resources. And is there a correlation between that issue as a complaint to the human rights in the Magna Carta?
Thank you. So, I'll just ask Megan to respond to that.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that I'm not familiar with that case, but I think that it does sound fairly similar. I guess what I was arguing more though, it's not so much the right to the resources, it's actually the right set out in the convention, but then states are obliged to take steps to the maximum available resources then to fund those rights. So there could be a comparison drawn. I haven't seen that done in a case yet, but it's just, yeah, something that I proposed in terms of making that link. Yeah, okay, yeah, I can definitely.
Okay, I'm sorry that the connection isn't good, but if you can email me a question, I promise I'll get back to you.
Thank you, thank you. Any other thoughts, questions, comments? No? Okay. Well, look, in that case, it just leaves me to congratulate Abdul and Megan again. Thank you for being with us, Megan for flying over, Abdul bearing with us while we sorted out our technical dramas. Please everyone just give another warm thanks. So we've got 20 minutes of coffee back at office. Yeah.
The backstory for the
Thank you.
Thanks very much. It was good.
Sorry, before everyone scuttles off, can we have a quick commercial break, which is that we've got copies of our latest book, The Greatest Invention, outside, 2 boxes. And for those of you who like the work of Tax Justice Network and would like to donate to support our work, can I suggest you come and join us outside? I'm happy to sign a copy for you and make a donation of just £10 to Tax Justice Network. For those of you who don't like our work, can I suggest you come out and make a donation of £20 and we'll do better next time. And for those of you who really love our work, can I suggest a £30 donation and you can have a sandwich lunch without cold. You can hear it.
This is a good idea. So, government now
So we'll be back in 20 minutes. I'll just mute the microphone and turn it on again in a minute. Okay, we're going to start the session soon.
What kind of photo? Graduating from business school, but my major was business law, so I'm stronger in law. I don't know that much about this candidate in ethics. Yes, and then there are some stakeholder credits. It's involved.
The driving things on the research.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. Planning to. Interviews with tax authorities. Probably need it.
And then it's got the fact that you've got that right. But it's also,
We met yesterday.
So when any of you know each other before?
No.
following
Yeah.
I think it's been very valuable when that was started to say
No, that's right.
Chasing them one more time.
That's the kind of
Somebody tell me.
Yes.
But based in the US now.
That's funny. Yeah. That's not really full though, is it?
No. Maybe we'll pick up.
Okay, well, we'll start. Welcome to session
6, which is going to focus on corporate tax. We don't have a discussant for this, so we're hopefully going to have a bit more time on this session to have a discussion afterwards. We're going to start with Laurie Finnair from, I believe, University of Helsinki.
Yeah, that's
right. So we'll start with him first of all. So go ahead. I don't know why the light is a bit muted, but we'll try to sort that out.
I think I'll stand. Feel more comfortable. Can you hear me? Yeah. So first, a little about myself. I'm doing PhD studies in the University of Helsinki Faculty of Law. My PhD is on exchange of information, automatic exchange of information. I was actually doing this morning an interview related to that study at the Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Louder. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I'll keep it closer, maybe it helps. Yeah, okay. Previously, I worked 7 years for the Finnish tax administration, so I have a practice background in law, and it's also has affected this study which I'm presenting today. I've done it with Matti Ylönen, who is currently doing his Fulbright at Yale in the US, so he was not able to attend here. Oh, that's basically it. So I'll go to the research. As you can see, we changed the title a bit. We removed the Dire Straits reference. It's actually not a work in progress in a way that it's in the middle of review process, and we just submitted the second version to an accounting journal. So it's now under review, and hopefully we will get it out sometime, not too long. Well, basically, it's about mining taxation. It's a case study. So yesterday, someone said that I'm not going to bore you with details, but I'm going to bore you with details. But first, a little about the theory. Well, there has been large research on global value chains and production networks from like production perspective, but not that much on global wealth chains, how the, for example, financial structures and likely affect the profit split in the multinationals. Then there's also one problem is that it's actually very difficult to study using aggregated data, tax avoidance, because basically the data doesn't include much information on tax avoidance structures. So most of the studies that have been using this kind of approach, they are able to prove some correlation between low tax rates and showing profit in certain countries, but they don't really have much information on details of tax avoidance structures. And the OECD has actually been pointing out this problem in the last year's BEPS report on measuring BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. So basically, no one really knows exactly what are the effects of base erosion and profit shifting, even though there are estimates, but they are estimates. And the problem is bigger when you try to measure the effects on a state level, because the databases, they don't include much information on tax shelters, for example. For example, Orbis database that is often used doesn't have much information on Luxembourg companies' financial accounts. They are included in the database, but the financial figures are usually not included. And for example, Luxembourg is one of the major corporate tax havens. Just a little about mining taxation. So I guess all of you are aware of it. So, well, basically mining is a speculative industry. There's high risk and big investments in the first place. You have to explore, develop the mines. But there's also high profit potential, so it's possible to make big profits. Of course, there are also risks for third parties related to environment, for example. And therefore, there's a demand to charge a rent for the extracting. So obviously, also the ores, the deposits are usually in most countries, they are owned by the state and not, for example, by the landowner. So that's also one reason to tax companies, to get a share for the society, for the ores that are given to enterprises to exploit. Well, how in practice are the mining companies taxed? Well, usually there are two different kinds of systems. There's the general corporate income tax on profits. In Finland, it's 20%, which is quite low compared to most mining countries. And then there are mining-specific royalties, which are ad valorem, which are like based on the value of the ores that are mined. In Finland, it's a bit different system compared to most mining countries. There are actually no royalties. There's a small royalty that is paid to the landowner, but it's very small. It's a similar system in Sweden and Norway, but not. Those are maybe the only countries that have this kind of system. Other taxes, like taxes on employment, are not that important because it's a capital-intensive industry, and actually the wages don't matter that much in this business usually. A little about metal ore mining in Finland. Finland is not the biggest mining country in the world, but still there have been 10 mines started in this millennium. At the moment there are 12 metal ore mines in Finland. The value of ore mines, it's about 1 billion euros per year, and it's the GDP share of the mining business is 0.1%, so it's not that big business in Finland, and it's probably not going to grow because the resource prices are not that high at the moment, and deposits are not very rich in Finland. So it's obviously not only about tax, it's about the business. So what we did in the research, well, there were 12 mines in Finland, and there were 11 companies that were exploiting them. So we checked financial accounts of all these companies. And then we chose 3 mines for a closer examination. What we looked for, we basically looked for tax planning structures, what they had done and what effects these things had on tax income from perspective of Finland and from perspective of the enterprises. Well, what we eventually did, we looked through nearly 200 annual reports and financial statements, and we manually did them, so it was quite a lot of work. The full list is in the manuscript that you can find from the Tax Justice Network website. There were 60 entities that were related to this 12 mines, so there were obviously a group of companies, and there are entities in different countries that are related to the mines. Then we also had another sources of information, so we were able to cross-check this information. We also actually published in the at the start of March, this report that included some of the empirical findings on tax planning structures through Finnish NGO, Finwatch. It's a corporate responsibility NGO. I have a part-time job there currently. So basically we sent information, also our interpretation what had happened to the mining enterprises, and they responded to the information, and actually they didn't deny our findings. So we were in that sense also able to verify the findings. We also used Orbis database, stock exchange reports, and other public available information. What we found 7 different arrangements that the 3 case companies use to lower their income tax. Now to the boring part. So there were 3 mines involved in the case studies, but I'll just have a little about just one mine. It's a Kevitsa mine. It's a nickel copper mine in Lapland, northern part of Finland. It was owned by, at the time of the study, Canadian First Quantum Minerals. Actually, in March, FQM made a press release that they had accepted offer from Swedish Boliden for the mine, worth some $700 million. So, but it's in middle of process, so it will be confirmed probably next month what will happen. Well, it's multinational. They have mines in other countries, and Finland two mines. In Finland, they were both included in our case studies. FQM acquired Kevitsa mine in 2008 when the mine was in development phase. I can refer to the presentation made by Sophie yesterday. He showed these phases of mining business, how they first it's exploration, then development, and then the actual mining. The price was nearly $300 million. So how did the acquisition happen? The company actually purchased the Canadian Minerals. It was another Canadian company which only asset was Kevitsa, so the whole company was acquired. The commercial production began 4 years after 2012, and since then the mine has been profitable according to the consolidated annual reports. So in 2014 the profit was $93 million based on revenue of $271 million. It's expected to deplete the deposit in 2042. I showed 2 pictures of the group structure, what happened, how they were able to make the taxes smaller in Finland. When the mine was purchased, the corporate structure related to Kevitsa mine looked very simple. It looked like this. So if you look in the bottom left corner, the mining operations were held by a Finnish subsidiary, and the mining rights were held by a Swedish holding company that didn't have any employees in Sweden or elsewhere. Just before the mining operations began, they changed the group structure quite radically, and after that it looked like this. So the biggest changes from tax perspective were that the finance company in Barbados was included in the structure, and then there were a couple of holding companies added in the structure, both in Sweden and Finland. How much more time I have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay, yeah. So I'll just go through one of the implications. There were many, but this is the simplest one. So basically, if a Canadian company had directly owned the Finnish subsidiary, the dividends would have been taxed 5%, according to the Finnish-Canadian tax convention, but using the Swedish holding company in between allowed them to pay the dividends to Canada without any withholding tax. So that was one of the simplest things they did. They also used intra-group interest to move taxable income from Finland to probably Barbados. There were tax effects of few millions. We were able to calculate them based on the financial accounts, and in future it might be even hundreds of millions if the mine will operate until 2042 and it will remain profitable and there are no legal changes in Finland. But we discovered six different loopholes in tax laws of different countries that were used in this tax avoidance in these 3 mines. So it's basically the interplay of these different loopholes that is used. So it's not about a law in a single country, but it's the interplay of the laws in different countries. What we were not able to examine was the transfer prices of the ores, and also if the interest rate were arm's length. It's not possible to do it based on public information because the transfer prices are set according to, for example, risks and contractual provisions between the companies, and they are confidential information, so it's not possible to check them. So tax effects might have been bigger than we were able to check. Well, yeah, I think this is told most of the things I wanted to say, so you can ask more in the discussion if you wish.
Okay, thank you. Perfect timing, absolutely spot on. So we're going to pass to Anders Pedersen now, who is from the Natural Resource Governance Institute. He's going to talk about the presence of tax haven-based companies in extracting contracts. So he's just going to set his things up and just stop that annoying bleep sound which keeps happening.
Oh yeah. How do we do that? Can we take off the sound? All right, how are you guys doing? We are not very far from lunch. It's one of the most attractive positions during the conferences to get the final day right before lunch, because you're really secure that everyone will be super pumped for this. So I'm Anders Pedersen. I work at Natural Resource Governance Institute. We are a think and do tank that works on extractive revenue governance, good governance in extractive sectors in resource-rich countries. We used to be called Revenue Watch. What I am working on is open data. So that is open data across contracts, project information, financial information, anything that can make decision makers do better decision with extractive information, issue data that can make civil society do better work, and data that can enable journalists to keep companies and governments accountable. So what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of digging we've done in a big database that we have created on extractive contracts. It's very much a work in progress. I really appreciate being here and being allowed to speak with so many great people. So I really enjoyed the conversation so far. So what's resource contracts all about? Over the past years, there's been a growing momentum in the advocacy community around extractives. That's Publish What You Pay, Oxfam. Many organizations have pushed quite aggressively on making contracts from oil and mining activities available. We're now starting to see the fruit of it, and therefore NRGI, together with Columbia University and the World Bank, decided how about we gather them in one place so that researchers and activists can actually find them. And that's what we've done. And so far we are at 1,100 extractive contracts documents. So that's both the main contracts between host governments and the companies, as well as other contract documents that are relevant to the decision. That could be amendments, it could be environmental agreements. Lots of other documents are starting to appearing as well. And this is how a lot of it looks. Like really, really nasty PDFs that fill up a lot of megabyte. What we do with this is really difficult to read. If you want to search it for, like, I know that there's this crook somewhere in the 70 contracts that we are looking at in DRC. And so how do you find it? Well, what we do is we make all of this searchable by scraping it and transcribing it so that folks can easily get access to it. And that's obviously, like, that's essentially a transaction cost that we're reducing, right? If people want to use it, instead of taking hours and hours of reading through it all, we now make it searchable so it's a little bit easier. But this is how they look. Contracts are part of a growing, you could say, ecosystem of extractive data that's available. And I mean, yesterday there were some discussions around Orbis data and company data. And what is really exciting is that so much of this data is now becoming available. Each of the data pieces that are coming out are important, but none of them are likely to be the silver bullet. So we're talking a lot about beneficial ownership data. We're talking a lot about country by country reporting. Each of these pieces are incredibly important for our work, but they all need to fit together. And so we think contracts are an important contribution to that, but we also really recognize that this needs to go together with, for example, open company records and other things. So how are contracts actually being made available now? About 60% of them are actually getting disclosed by governments. This is sometimes done in full, sometimes it's done partly, and sometimes it's done none at all. It's increasingly tricky to find out when governments release enough and the full thing. So we very often see countries that are releasing maybe 90% of their contracts, but the really nasty ones that was done with a bit of corruption in there or with foul play, they will then not be disclosed. We also see situations where all the contracts are disclosed, but then a new government comes in and they start amending the contracts, and these amendments are then not disclosed. So it's by no means sort of a clear-cut game. It's an internal catch-up where we work really closely with activists and civil society on the ground who knows what's going on and who can point and say what else is needed. A really interesting trend is that a lot of companies are starting to disclose contracts as a way of documenting their assets. So this is a sort of nifty trick if you're looking at a particular company. We're starting to see that the contracts are released, for example, in annexes to SEC filings in the US. And that's especially something we see from, like, mid-sized extractives company because they wanna attract investors. So that's certainly encouraging as well. This is the breakdown of types of contract documents that we're having at the moment. lots of production sharing agreements, lots of other joint venture agreements, concession agreements, investment agreements. And this is the composition of what we have at the moment. More than 250 contracts from Peru, around 100 from the Philippines, Guinea, DRC, Bolivia, Liberia, and so forth. Lots of really interesting data in there that's not yet being explored, and where you can all go and download it in bulk or access it contract by contract. Most of them are oil contracts, but we also have a significant chunk of iron, copper, and gold. So one of the first steps that we've had to do in order to get to work anything around the contracts has been to go through, read them, and then assign proper metadata to them. So normally the way we get access to contracts is that they'll be put up in a PDF on some ministry website. We have no idea who actually signed it. We have no idea when it was signed. You actually need to read through the contracts, diagnose what type of documents it is, and identify what kind of mine or extractive or oil field it relates to. We provide the appropriate identifiers, scrape them, and then following that, we annotate them under a taxonomy that we've developed with Columbia University so that it's easier to browse through the contract. There's, of course, lots of limitations still, and I've pointed to some of them. Disclosure is still emerging, so we're very much in a half glass, half full, half empty situation. In some countries, we have comprehensive data. In many countries, we have little or none at all. And then we are seeing a sort of a mid-group of countries, such as, for example, Guinea and DRC, where we actually have now a pretty good body of evidence. So where does that leave us? What I've started to do in this is to basically take a look at crown dependencies and overseas companies. What kind of presence do they have in extractive contracts? And I want to emphasize that this is the nominal share. This is the nominal participation. So we're not talking about second order presence of companies. We're talking about what is the jurisdiction of the company that is presented in the contract. And I think that's an important detail because we talk a lot about governments being cheated, governments not knowing who the real owners are. Well, we can actually see that in a number of countries, we find that governments are willingly signing deals with BVI entities, with Panama entities, with Bermuda entities. So this is, I think, an important baseline for saying leave alone the second order and all the secrecy. We're actually seeing that a lot of governments are willingly signing deals with tax haven jurisdictions, with companies based in tax haven jurisdictions. Now it's important to say, obviously, with a big disclaimer, that in many of these countries we don't have a comprehensive disclosure. So, for example, in Somalia, the 5 contracts that we have available there is from SEC filings from a specific company that released them. So this is not sort of a comprehensive share, but it still indicates that overseas companies are quite willing to are quite present in the data sample. I've also poked around, and again, huge disclaimer, this is work in progress, looking at, can we say anything about what type of governance we have and in the countries and how that relates to the presence of tax haven based jurisdictions, of companies that are based in tax haven jurisdictions. So an example, we have more than 200 Peruvian contracts in the database. They are all located, all companies that are signing Peru contracts are based in Peru, at least at first order. I'm not aware if this is because of a law in Peru or because of other issues. We don't know, obviously, how the second order is organized. This is not a guarantee against anything relating to tax revenue, but it does indicate that at least at the level of signature, at the first order, that the Peruvian government has some kind of hold of who are signing the deals. And that is just very clearly not the case in particular Guinea and DRC, where we have a quite sizable share of the contracts available, and where we see that tax haven-based companies are filling up a big chunk of it. So this is a little bit on the year-on-year developments, and this graph would have been a lot nicer if we could have had the share of total contracts. I'm working on that. But basically, the exercise is looking at, do we have various trends across years, right? So the majority of the resource contracts database contains contracts signed between 95 and 2015 or 14. And what there seems to be a bit of an indication is that KY, which is Cayman Islands, has like a peak around 07. BVI is really strong throughout the entire process. And then the second green line that you can see is Bermuda. But it does give some kind of sense around what kind of jurisdictions are trendy and what's the trend over time. And this is if we look at, so one of the things that I've been interested in looking at, and where we are unfortunately not far enough yet, is what kind of clustering behavior do we find between companies? So say we have one BVI entity entering an agreement. For example, we have a lot of Kurdistan contracts within this database. And what seems to be a sort of at least anecdotal trend is that you will have a Dutch-based company, then a Cyprus-based company, and then a third tax haven jurisdiction. And you do wonder if there is some kind of clustering method happening where one tax haven-based jurisdiction will possibly lead to a second and a third. That's not at all something that I can that I approve of yet, but I think that is an interesting sort of research path, and I'd be interested to know if others have experience with that from other sectors. Okay, and obviously, like an important conversation and academic discussion around a lot of this is what kind of role tax treaties are playing. So that's obviously an important part. So these are sort of three sort of very rough models of how we're seeing. We're seeing what type of contract consortiums we're seeing. We're seeing one company in the host country signing a deal. We're seeing that one company maybe with a tax haven company, and we're seeing also then groupings in the third category of multiple companies engaging in one company. Finally, and that's going to be really quick, three really quick cases of saying, how can we look at specific companies and their behavior? Can we actually start seeing if they are doing different things in different countries? And here, just three really quick ones from AngloGold Ashanti, which is a big mining company. It's based in South Africa. And they have one deal here that they signed in 2010 in DRC. It's signed with one holding company in DRC and then 6 entities in BVI with a variety, with British Virgin Islands, with a variety of shares, right? So this is participation share within the joint venture, that is constituting the mine. And you can see the beautiful PDF on the left-hand side there. Here we have them in Guinea, where again we have 4 different jurisdictions that are engaged in the same contract. And here we have an example from Peru, where it's one entity. They're based in Peru when they signed the deal. Again, I really want to emphasize that I can't say a lot about taxation from this, but we can start to look at what kind of jurisdiction behaviors do we see from companies. So that leaves us a lot of interesting questions, like, are there different strategies within companies when they engage in different jurisdictions? And that is often complex answers that we might get from that. There might be, if you are in an unstable regime where there's a lot of corruption, you may want to shield your assets in a secure location. And so the environment can often be quite complex based on, this might not only be taxation, it might be you want to insure your assets or other things. How is contracts going to stack up against the project payments we're going to start seeing coming, against the country-by-country reporting that we'll start seeing coming? That's going to be really exciting. We're starting to see more and more model contracts coming out. That's interesting because you can compare one model contract that was made by the Ministry of Finance, and then you can look at 10 contracts that were signed, and you can see maybe which company made the really good deal. How often do contracts change hands? We know from cases that one of sort of the corruption models that exist is that a well-networked business person will sign a deal with the Ministry of Mines, then he will then sell it off at the real market price to international investors. So tracking how contracts are changing hands and what stakeholders are involved throughout the process can be incredibly complex, and that's something where we simply need more evidence and more studies, I think. I think, let me maybe just quickly run through the website, resourcecontracts.org. It's a great website. You can go there and find stuff. It's all open data, Creative Commons licensed. This is how a contract page look like, where you can see all the metadata, what companies are involved, etc. This is where you can both browse the original PDF, and you can browse then the text that we scrape. And this is the latest project database that we have just created in order to capture project level reporting that's now going to come out from the UK, from EU countries, from SEC, etc. And finally, a plug to other great partners in the space, Open Corporates, Open Oil, OCCRP, all great. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Anders. So next we've got Henri Marion from the University of California, the Open School of Law there. He's going to be talking about the state administration of international tax avoidance. A lot of the papers and the information here is on our website, and if it isn't there already, we hopefully will make it available. So if you didn't get that very rich list of fantastic links there, hopefully we can get that. This is already right. Not with the hashtag. Right, we'll get that to use hashtag TJN16 and put some of those links out. Yeah. Now he's getting his phone now, so that's
yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we'll hand over to.
Okay, thank you so much. Very happy to be here and present my paper on Luxembourg leaks. The paper is, as you see, titled "The State Administration of International Tax Avoidance," but referring to the theme of the conference, I might as well just title it "How to Create a Tax Haven by Corrupting the Administrative Practice," because this is basically the argument of the paper, or one of the major arguments of the paper is that at least in the context of tax avoidance, Luxembourg, and this is something that is gleaned from the leaks, is made a tax haven by, let's call it, questionable administrative practices. Now, some background, as I'm sure you all know, in late 2014, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ, made public hundreds of privately negotiated, thank you, hundreds of privately, you're my hero now, hundreds of privately negotiated tax agreements, advanced tax agreements between Luxembourg tax authorities and multinational taxpayers. The rulings were leaked by a former employee at the Luxembourg office of PwC, and we heard that his trial started this week for allegedly doing bad things. The purpose of advanced tax agreements or rulings such as the ones that were leaked, at least on their face, is to secure the tax treatment of specific transactions. And this is by no means unique to Luxembourg. In the United States and many other jurisdictions have a process by which a taxpayer can approach the tax authorities in order to secure the tax treatment of a particular transactions. But in the case of the Luxembourg tax agreement, at least if you read journal reports at the time, it seemed that the rulings did much more than just to secure the tax agreement, the tax treatment of a transaction, but rather a media report that suggested that by securing Luxembourg rulings, taxpayers were able to avoid tax liabilities in jurisdictions other than Luxembourg. And this got me curious from an institutional point of view. What does it mean that the tax administrator helps taxpayer avoid tax liabilities in jurisdiction other than the jurisdiction of the tax administrator? How exactly does a Luxembourg ruling achieve that? How does it help the taxpayer? And who exactly in Luxembourg did the helping in this context? And there are actually two separate questions here. One is the substantive one. How can a ruling that presumably pertains only to domestic, securing the tax treatment from a point of view of domestic Luxembourg law helps a taxpayer to avoid taxes in jurisdiction other than Luxembourg? And second, there is and this is the substantive question, and the second question is the procedural question, and basically refers to the administrative process, how taxpayers engage Luxembourg tax administrators, and what exactly tax administrators do in the process, how the administrative process is being executed. So in order to answer those questions, I started reading the actual rulings that were made available by ICIJ. I stopped reading after 172 rulings. Now you may wonder why 172. First, in essence, this is a case study research, and I felt that at 172, I reached saturation. Not 171, 172. This is when I felt I reached saturation. But really, the real reason is that if I had read one more ruling, I don't know what I would. Really, it was a painful summer reading all the. I don't know. I would shoot myself. I don't own a gun, but I do live in the United States. It's very easy to get. So anyway, so I did read the rulings, or 172 of them. I think it's a relatively good sample to try and identify. This is not a statistical inference article, but rather it's a case study article, as I mentioned. So I think the sample is large enough to try and identify what I refer to as recurring administrative practices. And this is what I want to discuss, what I found in reading the rulings. And let me start with a substantive question. What exactly did Luxembourg do in order to help taxpayers to reduce taxes in other jurisdictions? And this is something that I call arbitrage manufacturing. And basically what arbitrage manufacturing is a process in which, in return for a fee, a tax administrator in one jurisdiction issues, let's call it a regulatory instrument for taxpayer from another jurisdiction in respect of an investment in a third jurisdiction. And the purpose of this ruling is to generate arbitrage opportunity that wouldn't exist otherwise. Now, what does that mean? I need to stand for that. Where's the microphone? Okay. So here is a very simplified example. We all know the taxpayers, one of the main ways by which they reduce their tax liabilities to engage in something that is known as international tax arbitrage, basically taking advantage of the differences between the laws of two jurisdictions involved in a transaction. So let's look at a simple example of how a ruling generates arbitrage opportunity where arbitrage opportunity wouldn't exist otherwise. So very simplified, extremely simplified example of something that happens a lot in the Luxembourg ruling, in about 60% of the rulings. So let's say we have a German investor that wishes to invest in France. There are two ways you can, and this is real investment. There is actually things on the ground in France, let's say, okay? Factories or whatever. So the investor organizes a subsidiary in France, there are two ways you can finance the subsidiary. One is by equity. And if I finance the subsidiary with equity, which means I take the money out in the form of dividend. The problem is that if the investment is successful, I pay tax in France, corporate tax, and the dividend is not deductible. So I end up paying tax in France. The dividends, when they're received in Germany, probably won't be taxed or will be taxed at a very low rate because of participation exemption. Most jurisdictions in the world will not charge tax on dividends or capital gains derived from investment in foreign jurisdictions, something that is known among many other names as territorial system. So that's the upside of financing with equity. So in this case, return from the investment will be taxed once in the source jurisdiction. Or I can finance the investment with debt and then extract the money in the form of the profits in the form of interest payments. The great thing about interest payments, we all know they're deductible. Yeah, good. No tax in France, or at least I'm able to strip out a lot of the tax in France. The downside, interest receipts would probably be includable in the income in the United States. Sorry, in the UK, or in Germany. Germany, it says Germany. So in Germany, which means income is again taxed once, this time at the residence jurisdiction. So not great, but not bad. Income is taxed only once, not twice. It would have been great for taxpayers if they could arbitrage on how Germany and France define debt or equity for tax purposes. For example, if I could create an instrument that is equity from the point of view of Germany, but is debt from the point of view of France, this will be perfect. This would be perfect. Why? Because interest would be deductible in France, but the receipts in Germany would be characterized as dividends and not includable. Therefore, income would be taxed nowhere. Problem? It's not that easy to do because these are somewhat reasonable countries. They would characterize an instrument as debt or equity probably the same way because they look at the substance of the instrument. Enters Luxembourg. What Luxembourg does is help taxpayers avoid the unfortunate results of logic. Basically, what would happen is that the investor in the residence jurisdiction will simply finance back-to-back the investment through Luxembourg. The bottom instrument will probably be something similar to debt, or which means that interest will be deductible in the source jurisdiction. The top instrument will actually be an equity instrument, or an instrument that the return of which is very similar to equity return. But, and this is why Luxembourg is so good to taxpayer, Luxembourg issues a ruling that says, yeah, we know it's equity, but we're going to, well, they don't say we know it's equity, even though they do know it's equity. They say, nonetheless, we're willing to treat the instrument like debt. Therefore, interest is deductible in Luxembourg. But when the payments are received at the residence jurisdiction, they're received as some form of equity return, which for the most part will not be includable in income. The bottom line is that what Luxembourg did is synthetically generated arbitrage opportunity that wouldn't have existed had the investment been made directly from the residence to the source jurisdiction. And it's important to note that Luxembourg doesn't actually get any investment out of it. Even the money doesn't stay in Luxembourg. Luxembourg is simply a conduit to facilitate stripping out income in the source jurisdiction and making sure that there is no includable income, or at least to defer the inclusion of income in the residence jurisdiction. And in return, Luxembourg charges a fee. Well, Luxembourg taxes something, but I call it a fee, and I will explain in a few minutes why I call it a fee. But I'd like to dedicate most of my time to how the administrative process is being executed. How can you generate such a magnificent result from the point of view of a multinational taxpayer? And the question is interesting because if you look at the law in Luxembourg, it looks nothing like what you would expect from a tax haven, at least in the context of tax avoidance. The combined corporate tax rate there, national and local, is about 29%. They have anti-abuse provisions in place. They state that they're only issuing tax rulings to companies that have substantive presence in Luxembourg. So how are taxpayers able to generate that through Luxembourg? Obviously, there are two sides to the story. There's the administrators, and there are the taxpayers and their advisors. But I'll look primarily the time I have left in the administrators. And obviously, when I speak of administrators, the first question one has to ask is, who are the administrators? So one of the things I did, I coded who are the people to whom the rulings are addressed, the submissions are addressed, and who signs, who approves the ruling. So first, we had Mary Skoll. Many of you heard his name, I guess. He headed the department within Luxembourg Inland Revenue that issues the rulings for 2 decades. He was there for 3 overall. Second, there's no second. That's it. There's only Mary Skoll. There's one person. So all rulings in the sample, 172, all submissions were addressed to Mary Skoll. He signed all the rulings. He approved all of them. Which begs the question, how much can one person do, right? Because there are hundreds and hundreds of rulings only in the sample. So to begin with, I will just note that none of the approvals that Mary Skoll gave contain any reasoning. It's just taxpayers' positions are accepted verbatim. So it's either a stamp, or there is one paragraph, cookie cutter paragraph, where Marius just changed the dates and the name of the taxpayer sponsoring the ruling. By the way, when I say taxpayer, I mean multinational. That's important to note. And so, as I said, I asked myself, how much time could Marius could have dedicated to review rulings? I mean, one person. So here's an example. April 21st, 2010, 11 new ruling submissions, 8 approved the same day. And now some of the submissions are hundreds of pages long. Okay? I'm sure he read all of them. And he also approved 4 rulings that he previously received. And that's only for the rulings in the sample, 172. So I don't know what the actual number, but even if we look just at the rulings in the sample, it's unlikely to mean that he actually read the 8 rulings submission he received the same day and was able to substantively consider them and decide that, yes, they're worthy of approval, verbatim, the way the taxpayer wanted them. Here is an overall picture. I'd like to note this number here. About 40% of the rulings in the sample were approved the same day they were submitted. The median is 5 days. Probably there was a weekend in the middle or something. I don't know what the reason was for the delay in this context. Another evidence, I think, so my circumstantial conclusion is that Marius didn't seriously review the submissions, because it is unlikely that the person would be able to do so. Another evidence for the lack of review refers to the standards by which the rulings were reviewed. And as I said, about 60% of the submissions were about debt or equity classification for tax purposes, the classification of financing instruments, and you would expect that when a taxpayer requests ruling in respect of classification of financing instrument, the financing instrument, the documentation, will be attached to the submission, right? Because this is what we're ruling about. Well, yes, you could expect that. So here's an example from one of the submissions. A copy of the executed MFA, Master Facility Agreement, will be provided to you at a later date. So the taxpayer actually acknowledged, I'm not providing you with the instrument. I will note that in this particular context, there was no economic terms in the submission, other than the fact that we promised that we're going to charge arm's length interest, but we're not telling you what it is. Nonetheless, the MFA will be considered debt. This is from the ruling for corporate income tax purposes, and interest thereon will be fully deductible. So here's a case where Marius had no details on the instrument in respect of which he was asked to rule. Nonetheless, he did rule that the instrument is debt for tax purposes. Here is the overall picture. About half of the submissions, this is the top bar, do contain full documentation of the instruments. About a third contain only a short term sheet or a general description of the instrument, which in my mind is certainly not enough in order to make a ruling whether an instrument, the financing instrument, is debt or equity for tax purposes, and the rest simply have no description of the instrument. Notwithstanding that fact, there's still, Marius agrees to rule that the instrument is classified as either debt or equity. So if no documentation and no review, how did Marius actually make substantive issues based on which standard? I don't know, probably it's that standard of what taxpayers want. Here is another example that shows that. This is, the bar show the top five most common financing instruments that appear in the sample. By the way, there are 24 different types of instruments in the sample. But these are the top five, and you can see the top one, for example, PPL or profit participating loans, almost always characterized as debt. This is the light area in the bar, except if the taxpayers want to classify them as equity. In a few cases, then this is the black part of the graph of the bar. The second one, interest-free loans. About 2/3 of the time they're classified as equity, but 1/3 of the time they're classified as debt. So there's no real consistency. And I assure you that you'll be pressed hard to find anything in the terms of those instruments that make them economically significant from one another in order to classify one interest-free loan as equity, but the other as debt. I'll skip things. How am I on time?
19 minutes.
Sorry?
19 minutes in, so.
Okay, so I'll skip that. And here's what Luxembourg gets in return. Luxembourg doesn't simply agree to do that for free, obviously, but they're doing it for very little. So remember the back-to-back payments I showed you? What Luxembourg asked taxpayers to simply leave a small margin, a small spread in Luxembourg, which is then taxed at Luxembourg tax rate of 29%. But as you can see, this is actually from one of the rulings. The schedule is very, very minimal. So at the most, you'll be charged 0.25% spread, and this will be taxed at 0.29%, which creates a very low taxation. And as you can see, it's regressive. It actually encourages you to leave more to finance more money through Luxembourg, because the more you finance, the less Luxembourg is going to charge. Here is a simulation of how it looks like, assuming assuming an investment rate of return of 5%. So what are we seeing here? And with this explanation, I'll finish. The horizontal line shows the amount of finance through Luxembourg in millions. The broken line shows the amount of taxes saved in the source jurisdictions. In the source jurisdiction, again, in millions. This assumes a 25% corporate tax rate in the source jurisdictions. The dotted line is the amount of fees collected by Luxembourg in thousands, because they collect in thousands. And the black line, which I think is the most interesting line, based on the schedule I showed you earlier, is the marginal tax rate that the taxpayer pays, which under the assumptions of the simulation, which is 5% return, is 1.45% maximum. As you can see, the more you finance through Luxembourg, the lower it gets to very, very low numbers. So basically, this is why I call it a fee, because the more taxes you avoid in other jurisdictions, the more tax Luxembourg gets to collect. And the problem with this tax is that it is simply determined based on margin. And the margin is determined based on nothing other than the amount financed through Luxembourg. In that sense, Luxembourg is like your bank. Like when you wire transfer, the bank will take money from you. When you finance through Luxembourg, Luxembourg will take money from you. Taxpayers much rather pay Luxembourg 1.45% tax rate every year than pay, say, 25% at the source. So this is it. I'll stop here.
Thanks for clarifying what you meant by taxpayers. Can get confusing. So we've got about 23 minutes to open it up for some comments and questions. So I think maybe we'll take 3 and then go back to the panel. That's probably the best way to do it. So Atul over there, that's 1, 2, 3. Okay, go.
Omri, I like the word arbitrage manufacturing. Never heard that before.
I came up with it.
Yeah, okay. I've done a paper on systemic arbitrage, like KPMGs, so similar. The word arbitrage is actually used by economists to almost, the underlying assumption is that this is kind of in a perfect market, helps to complete the market, is a good thing, a legitimate activity, etc. And I'm wondering whether we should be changing that word altogether, one. And secondly, I think I was speaking to Sol earlier, this whole, see, one of the, I mean, we've seen, if you look at last week's news around Mitsubishi and pollution, and you know, this whole, there is a whole industry of regulatory arbitrage, which has got all these kind of networks across. Well, we must find a way, how can regulators have power to kind of really tackle this industry head on? And is it a political question? Or, because if we can somehow stop that, then it makes regulation more effective.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, how do we hit them where it hurts? I was wondering the same thing, so we'll go to this gentleman.
Well, thank you, Omri, for the presentation. I used to work at KPMG in Luxembourg, and it kind of reminded me of some of my experience. And I just, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment about the timing of how ValueScope used to allocate to all of the big fours. Basically, when ValueScope will be coming, because it used to come to KPMG to go to every single big four. And just imagine we had about 10 partners working on taxation. And we had around 3 minutes per structuring, per company. And just do the math. And basically, one day you have maybe 50 rulings signed by a month. So it was pretty fast and quick and very efficient.
And up at adjustment, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'll get some questions. Some really interesting data. I'm interested in this, obviously this idea, the Seagull from Wigan idea of wealth chains. And I mean, you've got some really interesting case study material about how I'm interested in these ideas about how you're operationalizing the study of wealth chains. It seems like potentially a really big area. And maybe if you could talk a little bit more, there's all kinds of questions. If you could talk a bit more about how you're tackling wealth chains. And I think this Barbados subsidiary is part of the story, but how that has to be explained, I guess, through the notion of global wealth chains rather than value chains. We could use that, and I suppose also how intellectual property fits. I guess I'm just asking you to operationalize this theoretical idea of global wealth chains.
Yeah. In a way, like Omri was explaining how it happens. Well, yeah, sorry. Well, in this case, well, it's actually pretty similar what Omri was explaining about the structure. So basically, it's often very simple. There is a debt
that is given by, for example, Barbados company to a, for example, Finnish subsidiary, and then so there are assets, there's equity in Barbados, for example, and then through interest, it's shifted from Finland to Barbados. In one of the case studies, there was also a Luxembourg company involved. So also the financial accounts in Luxembourg are available, so we can check them. They are not in Orbis database, but we can get them. Speaking of immaterial rights, in one of the cases, the mining concessions that were related to Finnish mine located in Finland, they were allocated to a Swedish subsidiary, and based on Finnish law, it's material rights, and the capital gains from them, they are not taxed in Finland, even though the mine is located in Finland. So that's an example of material rights. I hope I answered your question.
So I agree that the term arbitrage, at least in the context of regulation, is probably the wrong term, but it's just this is the term we use in literature, because in economic terms, arbitrage refers to basically two substitute investment, completely similar investment opportunities that are just priced differently, so it makes no sense to hold the more expensive one. But in the context of regulation, what we're really speaking about is one investment opportunity, and the arbitrage basically is trying to find the cheaper regulatory regime, but we don't really change anything in the context of the investment. It's still the same investment. It's only one investment opportunity. What can we do about it? I mean, and this is specifically true in tax, right? Because in tax, what income shifting basically achieves, or arbitrage in tax achieves, basically allows me to leave the investment in the same place where I get to enjoy infrastructure, skilled labor force, or whatever, but pay tax to a different jurisdiction, like Luxembourg, at much lower rates. So this is basically, I'm just discounting the cost, but I still enjoy the benefits. So there is unbundling of cost and benefits in this context. So I agree, it's probably not the right term. What should we do about it? So if you look at BEPS, part of BEPS is actually specifically intended to tackle arbitrage, at least in the tax context. So for example, Action 2 looks at hybrid mismatch arrangements, basically says if income is deductible in one jurisdiction, it has to be includable in the other. Or a jurisdiction must not give deduction to a payment unless it is deductible in the other jurisdiction. But that said, again, this looks into the substantive aspects of arbitrage, and the problem that I identified here is that arbitrage is just achieved through certain administrative practices. So I think the problem is that it doesn't matter what the law is, you'll always find a small jurisdiction that is willing to insert itself as an intermediary between the source and residence jurisdiction and generate something that in effect creates an arbitrage, which means to me that the way to tackle it is not, we do need to do what BEPS do, Action 2, for example. We need those substantive rules, but we also need some sort of BEPS action, which there isn't now, about proper administrative practices and sanctions against jurisdiction where the administrative practices are ridiculous, like in this context. Regarding your question about 3 minutes per transaction, I'm not sure if you introduced it as some sort of defense to what Marius did, but it actually emphasized one point. It's horrible that Marius had to consider a transaction in 3 minutes, because to me it means that he didn't consider the transactions. And the reason why Marius did that is because he wanted to give the ruling the same day or the next day or in a week from now. And this is not how you do it. If there is a transaction structure in respect of which there is really something that is not clear under Luxembourg law, then you sit and you read the submission and you consider it for months if needs be, because this is what happens in other jurisdictions. In the United States, it will take you a few months usually to get a ruling from the IRS regarding the transaction. To me, the problem here is that the transactions at issue were had nothing to do with uncertainty of tax law. This was completely an activity by Big Four brokering for tax rulings, because if there was an issue, the Big Four should have given an opinion. So if there is a real legal issue, give an opinion, and if you think there needs to be a ruling, then go and ask for a ruling. But if what you do is you solicit 15 rulings in 5 minutes, what you're actually doing, you're brokering for a regulatory instrument. Probably the Big Four in this context are completely relieved of any liability because they don't have to think about it. They just go to the friendly administrator, get the ruling, get the money from the client, and basically this is what they are. They're brokers, they're not advisors. So, and this goes to Alex's papers presented yesterday about the role of the Big Four. I think that the Big Four here played, I discussed a little bit of it in the paper. I didn't have time to discuss it here, but basically they're a culprit because their act, not as advisor, as I already said it, but as brokers for rulings.
Quick question.
I'd like to continue to what Andre said. So, yeah, I've been administrator myself in Finland, and one thing in Finland is that limits to administrator is that we have to follow the law. And basically, what happened in Luxembourg, they didn't follow the arm's length principle in the decisions, and obviously, like Andre said, in the UK, it takes a few weeks or months. It takes, in transfer pricing cases, to make the advance ruling, it takes some time, and even usually in Finland, we don't give a ruling on the actual transfer price, but usually on the method, so the method you can use, so we don't check the benchmarks in the advance rulings. So it's, in my opinion, it's a corrupt system. Obviously, it's not. It's not supposed to happen in legal statement. Well, one thing in the EU, what has happened, how the EU might limit this is the competition law. So the Commission has started to examine this kind of rulings in Luxembourg and also in Netherlands. That it would be illegal state aid. So the process is going on, but this is another perspective from which you can limit this kind of rulings.
Okay, so Anders wanted to come back on something, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, I just have a quick comment on the discussion of the authorities' capacity and integrity, and I mean the sort of beating a dead horse, the need for full transparency in these situations are absolutely critical. We can see in a number of countries we have, it can be captured by the Big Four. You can have political peddling where you cripple financially agencies. There are so many different ways where agencies can get compromised. I mean, speaking of Mitsubishi and Volkswagen, that's a classic regulatory issue. The EPA shut down the facility that could do the emission testing, and it was at the end up to a small nonprofit and a state university in West Virginia to actually do the tests. So, I mean, the automatic information sharing that OECD is proposing is the equivalent of saying that for emission testing, we will only allow EPAs around the world to be able to test emissions from cars, and nobody else should do it. And I think it's absolutely critical that we think about in all of these conversations that capacity building and securing funding for these agencies is critical, but transparency is really important cornerstone.
Okay, we'll take 4 more questions and comments. So
my question is sort of from the sort of qualitative research.
Sorry, can somebody just run up the microphone? We didn't do this earlier, thanks. And can you just turn it on at the top? Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Henri. Is Marius Koss a living job?
I'll answer later. Or you can answer.
As of yesterday, we didn't turn up to the trial, he was on sick leave.
So, it's actually much more interesting than that, the story of, can I answer just?
Go on,
Okay. The story of Marius Cole gave one interview to the Wall Street Journal at the time, about the time of the leaks, and no one heard him ever since. No one knows where he is, basically. So what happened is that the European Parliament had an inquiry committee. They summoned him. They don't have subpoena power as an inquiry committee, but they did ask him to show up. He said he will. He never did. He never returned the letters after that. He was supposed to show up. You say he didn't show up yesterday. He was supposed to show up to the trial of the whistleblower. Didn't show up. So no one heard Marius Cole's side of the story, and obviously this is very deliberate. I don't know who is instigating this, but this is very weird that no one was able to get to him. That's why.
Was he summoned?
Yes.
Isn't that not contained?
He was sick leave. He claimed he was sick leave.
Okay, right. Okay, so we'll get the next one down here. Thanks, Lily. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I've got 3 more after that, so
Okay, this is for in relation to mining companies. Well, and global wealth chains that was mentioned before also. One thing that you didn't address on what your exposition is the price of the actual mining exports, if they are done as exports. What I've seen in other cases, in other extractive industries cases, in Argentina at least, is that the price is generally a big problem. And it's a lot of times when we analyze transfer pricing issues, we think that it's intangibles that are the most important one. I can't put I can't balance all that and say which part is the worst part, but the price of the commodities is a big issue. And normally companies in the mining sector, at least in Argentina, what they do is they export them in a very ore way. So it's very difficult to actually compare those prices to an actually quoted international market price, because it's for instance, for gold, you get gold with the rock, and you can't actually compare it with actual gold prices. So, in relation to global wealth change, I think, when this was discussed also yesterday in terms of if these are global value chains or global wealth chains. Of course, they are global value chains, but you need to see also that at the point of the extraction, you're getting their connection with a global wealth chain, and it's normally done also through the intermediaries that are introduced at that stage. Actually, for the exports are not done directly. They are also using either companies in Luxembourg, or I don't know if Luxembourg in this case, but in general in tax havens also, and who are doing also logistical services and providing us alleged substance for those transactions, either logistical or insurance costs that are using those way. And I was wondering if you are addressing any of those issues in your paper.
Okay, so we'll go to Marcus next, then Ronan, then Sol, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thank you, Omri. Very fascinating what you did there. On one slide, you had shown that this table with the margins with a PwC header on it. I wonder, is this a document, or is this a document, this table, that shows up in any official Luxembourg document, or is this a PwC informal sort of compilation of what they understand to be the rules? Because this clearly should be all the evidence you need to have a state aid trial across the board through all rulings for convicting Luxembourg of committing that. And I wonder also if you could inform us about the status of the appeals. I think a few of the countries that were now, after the Commission's decisions, state aid, legal state aid, have announced that they are going to appeal against this, I think, with Belgium, Ireland, Luxembourg. What's the status here? What do you think are the chances for this to go through European court? And finally, I'm also wondering, Maurice Kohl, I mean, the motivation, why would one person do this if he wasn't backed by the top politicians of his place? One motivation that is at hand is a financial motivation, possibly, to have received enormous kickbacks for these deals. Is there any evidence or any investigations in this? I mean, why don't we treat him as a tap and freeze his accounts, put him on a UN sanctions list, and search for offshore accounts? Isn't there a strong case to argue that if it's not been rather stamped by the top political superiors of this, that this is a core motivation in the game, and what justice departments could follow up on this?
I mean, in the sense of that, it's not a question, I'm not sure, maybe you're can answer, but we always talking. I mean, it sounds like they commit scandal, clearly. I always thought LuxLeaks was a much serious scandal than any other. So it's a Panama generates enormous media interest, but really, what Luxembourg story is a bigger story. Now, clearly already you spend a lot of time finding circumstantial evidence that Mr. Marius Paul is not taking this work seriously, but when you heard the story, he's actually coming to the accounting firms and basically signed one or the other. It's a wholesale business. Okay? And I would like to probe again, maybe you and other people, perhaps yourself here, and other people here, but the legality of what's going on here? Do the accounting firm has an issue here to answer, either in terms of the law or in terms of their own norms? They make certain claims on their website about their type of behavior. Do they have an issue here? Does Luxembourg has an issue here? I mean, is it to do with the case of Mr. Paul broke the law, or he broke certain norms? And another thing that occurs to me, I looked at some of these standard things that you find that you look at and say, but they're fairly elaborate. I ask myself, in light of the 3 minutes decision-making process, why are they so elaborate? Why go into the trouble of creating such an elaborate structure? You don't have to. And I can come up with 2 answers. First of all, basically, you dupe your clients. The more elaborate, the more you can charge for it. And secondly, there must be another layer of issues we are unaware of your story.
So next, and we're running out of time, so
I'm trying to go back to our discussion yesterday about criminogenic risk. Well, it's clear that what was happening in Luxembourg was an extreme case. And I think that is a case very likely the European Commission will win on the same day. But they brought a whole range of other cases at the same day. My suspicion is that they will not likely to win more. So I think we have to look at what are the criminogenic risks. It's easy to focus on the very exceptional case. That's an idea in this context. But what leads to that? And I think the problem is that the international tax laws are becoming really so dysfunctional. But the way they're administered by different countries leaves a high degree of discretion. Luxembourg carried its regime, Belgium has some own regime. And as we know, the G20 has the OECD to deal with this by ensuring multinational tax law activities occur and values created. But what they've done is then create a whole other other more complex rules, which still leave a lot of discretion for individual administration. Because the G20 not only has that, but they also say do that while preserving each country's tax sovereignty. I think that's what Luxembourg and the others are behind. They say, we are sovereign, we can decide what is tax in Luxembourg. And that's the central dilemma. And that gets to the other question, what can we do about it? How do we tackle it from the respect? And not just target the very exceptional cases like Luxembourg. And I want to pick up Apple's question because a lot of it is about the distances that they use, so there is the concept of tax competition, which is kind of footballs to it. But then there's the trying to produce rules that are harmful, and they're trying to have criteria, which suggests that aren't sovereignty, they want a good. So we kind of first have to develop, I think, a different system, but maybe also some systemic too, what we did in relation to the offshore system. To develop a financial secrecy. We're trying to look at how this is systemic, so we can't matter of the obvious case of how the whole system works. There is some discussion, I think Mark can say more, about maybe having a tax competition, but we need a better term, because competition is good. The IMF has used the term spillover. Somehow we have to get at the issue, but I think Henri is very well highlighted. It's not just about different countries making a choice about what it's not real. So how decisions makers want to pick a delivery. I think in previously you're right with this concept, with the concept of maybe money policy. So maybe the concept
I say so explicitly in the article.
So it is actually 1 o'clock, but if we can just wrap up and just make the final comments, and we'll try to squeeze this last very quick one in, and then go for lunch.
Okay, so regarding the margins, this is from one of the submissions. The specific document is a submission in one context of the private equity funds that didn't even know how much they were going to finance through Luxembourg. This is why they had the schedule. So if we finance that amount, this is what we pay. Funds and a higher amount, this is what we pay. But this is consistent. The numbers are consistent among the submissions. So in terms of practice, yes, there is an administrative practice for specific margins, specific face amounts, which is particularly interesting because you said it seems state aid. It actually is because there is a decision by the European Commission from 2002 about Luxembourg margins that were based on a circular from 1989 that was withdrawn in 1996 that did exactly that, or almost exactly that, and the Commission said it's state aid. However, there is no recovery because the circular has been withdrawn. Apparently, they didn't care that much that they withdraw the circular because they kept doing it. Actually, it is even much worse than the circular because the circular minimum spread was 1/8, and here you see the minimum spread is much lower than that. I'm not sure that state aid, by the way, personally speaking, is the best way to go after it because in each specific case, even if you prove that this is state aid, the recovery we can discuss why later will be extremely minimal. Will be thousands of dollars. So even if there is state aid. So I think this is why the Commission went after the bigger cases about transfer pricing and not about funded financing. I don't know what's going on with the appeals right now, but I know what you know. They did appeal the Commission's decisions. What is the motivation? A couple of questions here. We need to be very careful about what we're saying because we have nothing other than circumstantial evidence. Actually, there is no evidence whatsoever that he had any illicit motivation. I agree that the entire process seems weird, to say the least. But my best view of it, the best possible view, is that what Marius did was simply executing a Luxembourg policy of being very friendly to taxpayers. And in that sense, I don't think he did, if that's the case, he didn't do anything illegal, but then there is a question we need to ask the people who set the policy that happen to have the person, I would say, who may have executed the policy and happen to be in charge of the European Commission that investigates the policy. Go figure, right? How does that happen? I'm speaking, of course, of Juncker. You didn't realize that, but even Juncker didn't really, at no point gave the full side of the story, just say, I never knew about it. And all Marius said in the Wall Street Journal is that I never had any problems with Juncker. I don't know what it means. But we don't really know what was their interaction because so far they were not forced to talk about it. Why elaborate structures? I don't think this is to the detriment of the client. One legitimate reason for the very elaborate structure is that you need them to actually save taxes in other jurisdictions. In other jurisdictions, it's much more complex than just asking a ruling from Luxembourg. So you actually have to put a lot of creativity into planning. And Luxembourg is just somewhere in the middle where you need the financing to go. So I think the structures are actually legitimate. I mean, legitimate from the point of view of the legal practice. Whether they're good or bad from a policy point of view, a different question. And also, it gives the appearance of legitimacy. When you have a structure, you also put a lot of thought into. So I don't think this is to the detriment of the client. Is there any question after that?
Does any
Yeah, I can answer the question in relation to Veronica's question in relation to the prices of force and resources. To answer it, I think I have to go back to the basics of corporate taxation, which is, well, the two basic rules are the arm's length principle and separate entity doctrine. And one of our major conclusions in the article is that the system is broken because of these principles. They don't work in practice. And I think that's one of the contributions of our research. And well, basically, like a multinational company, it's like one entity. It's controlled from headquarters, but the taxation is based on separate entities, so like local subsidiaries, basically. But the headquarters, and it's, well, basically it's like imagined that the separate entities would be independent, but they're not, since the headquarters, they can decide the business model and of the separate entities, and because of that they can affect the prices, for example, prices of ores, and there are many ways to do it. It's about contractual provisions, it's about where the risks are, where the functions of the multinationals are, and you could even plan a business model where, for example, there would be a mine in Finland and the profits of or sales of the wouldn't be like attributed to a Finnish subsidiary. You could make this kind of contract mining subsidiary that would only receive a service fee from another subsidiary. So it's very easy to affect the prices of the ores, and it's even possible to move the sales from a country to another using these different business models. So, and it's not possible to access these business models without confidential information. That's all authorities are, of course, able to get them, but they are not public. So we couldn't access them, and that's why we didn't look that deeply into the prices.
Okay, well, we're really outrageously overrunning, so unless you've got something absolutely crucial to add, maybe we can take it outside and go for lunch. But we're going to try and squeeze one very, very last thing in here, but just to let you know that we want to be starting fairly promptly for session 7, which is going to be something that's really unmissable, and I believe we're not going to be live streaming it for the benefit of people who are watching us. Because these are absolutely brand new figures that have not really been heard before, it's a work in progress, so don't miss that. And I'll just hand over very quickly, very patiently waiting.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention, because it's unbelievably interesting what you were saying, Andrea, about the Luxembourg law, tax law, looking like normal tax law, but I mean, I've been looking at financial regulation in Luxembourg. And it's the same. I mean, I started talking to people and they said, no. I mean, this is all very proper. I mean, they have this very, very good regulations. That may be, but the execution of it is just like the one in the
describing, I mean, all the dirty deals in the Icelandic banks, they went through the subsidiaries in Luxembourg. I got a meeting with people from the financial regulator in Luxembourg. The most memorable thing was the enormous size of the meeting table. And there were this group of people, 5 or 6 people sitting, and I was telling them the stories from Iceland and from what had been going on in the Icelandic banks. So, and then of course my question was, aren't you going to look at this? And there were a lot of darkened eyes and very downcast faces. No, they haven't looked at a single thing, and yet the special prosecutor in Iceland has visited them on several occasions to do house searches in Luxembourg. Nothing has been done in Luxembourg. So that's the kind of financial regulator we have in Luxembourg.
Okay, right, well thanks everybody for being patient and over early into lunch. Don't be late to come back at 2 o'clock because we've got some really important stuff to do. The people joining us on the live stream, we will turn the live stream on again at 3 o'clock for session 8. Okay, thanks everybody, thanks to everybody.
But